Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the event. I'm Rita Tritcher, Senior Business Writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail. It is great to see you here today at the Globe and Mail's event space. All these people in person, it's fantastic. And also a very warm welcome to everyone viewing the event virtually from across Canada. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the Globe and Mail is headquartered is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We are very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this unceded land and to listen and learn from Indigenous communities and leaders as we work together toward a sustainable future. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to recognize the sponsors that are making the day possible. They include HSBC Bank Canada, Schneider Electric, Toyota, and Flow, along with our academic partner, the DeGroote School of Business. Over the course of this afternoon, we will be talking about net zero, a topic that is top of mind for business leaders. Organizations across all sectors are setting climate targets and mapping out plans to achieve them. Today's speakers will provide insights for your own businesses to help support your own progress. Our program will conclude with a cocktail reception for those of you here in the room, and I would like to invite you all to stick around for that and to enjoy a drink and some networking. I'll be there, so come network with me. The terrace is open, and as you can see, the views in this building are just spectacular. Our first guest today will talk about how Canadian businesses are doing with climate targets and net zero. So joining us virtually is Ryan Riordan, Director of Research with the Institute for Sustainable Finance at the Smith School of Business. So welcome, Ryan.
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Here I am. I'm all around.
All right. So Ryan, the Institute for Sustainable Finance has been tracking climate targets among publicly traded companies in Canada. And I hear you have new data ready. So please share some of your findings from the research on how Canadian companies are doing compared with their peers in other countries.
Yeah, I'd love to. We've been tracking, let's say, call it the road to net zero or emissions for Canadian publicly listed firms for 3 or 4 years now. We should have a report ready in the next week or so. In fact, we're just sort of going through the final steps. Let me just give you the highlights of what we're going to say in the report. The highlights are about 169 firms in the TSX indices report. That's about 72% of the total. That's up a little bit from the last time we did this, so up from 68 to 72. So, a couple more firms are reporting this year than they did last year. 134 disclose their targets. So there's a difference between disclosing your emissions and disclosing your targets. So about 134 or 57% of firms, which is up again as well from 113 firms the previous year. And then, we find that there is some room for improvement. Often there are very few details on how these targets are going to be achieved. So it's around 36%, and only 13% of firms, in our opinion, provide really credible detailed plans. And now to the second part of your question is, how are we doing relative to other countries? So in terms of emissions disclosure, we're on par with the US and with Japan, but we're much, much further behind the EU. And there's probably a lot of structural reasons for that, including that their economy is just different and that they're ahead of the curve on that. But in terms of targets, hard to say. We haven't really looked at everywhere across the world in terms of targets, but probably the same as in terms of emissions disclosure.
Okay, so you touched. Oh, continue.
Too long. Go ahead.
So you've sort of touched on this already, but what do you think is contributing to the pace of climate targets and net zero commitments in Canada?
Yeah, so I touched on it, but I think there's a lot more nuance there. So in the EU, emissions disclosure, and now more recently some targets disclosure, has been mandated for a much longer period of time. So in some cases, in some countries, emissions disclosure was required in the late 90s, right? And so I think we're playing catch up in terms of the mandated disclosure. I think that also just the general public, it just expects this type of disclosure in the EU, and I actually happen to be in Germany right now in Munich. So I think this just sort of generally expected. And in some cases, the structure of the economy is just different. I mean, there is some oil and gas production, and there is also a lot of oil and gas used for energy production, but it's not nearly as predominant as it is in Canada. And it's really, except for Norway and the UK, it's not really a key part of the economy. So it's probably easier to mandate disclosure.
Okay, so here's a question that we receive a lot from our readers. What exactly are we talking about when we say, quote, climate targets?
Well, that's a good question. Some people might mean different things, but what we generally refer to when we talk about climate targets is we're really thinking about emissions, and we're particularly thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. And then when we talk about targets, it's not usually that we're thinking about, well, you know, how many megatons or gigatons do we emit? We usually think about these things in terms of intensity. So how many tons of CO2 do we emit per barrel of oil that we produce, or per dollar of revenue, or per employees? And so really we're talking about that type of target. And then oftentimes we're talking about this target on, well, are we making steps to get ourselves, or a firm, or a country, or a jurisdiction, to net zero by 2050? And so that's a very, very popular target. So, we're 10% of the way to getting to net zero by 2050. And so I think those are the important points: emissions, intensity, and then, well, are we on the way to meeting whatever target it is that we have? It could be 2030, 30% reduction, or 45, or net zero by 2050.
Okay, and what are the possible implications for businesses in Canada that are lagging their peers?
Well, there are a lot of implications. I'll probably restrict myself to the financial implications as someone from the Institute for Sustainable Finance and as a financial professor. One of the things that you really find important is that, well, investors are just really losing their appetite for high-emitting firms. So that means that capital is flowing away from firms that don't appear to be tackling or doing a good job of tackling emissions, that don't appear to be serious about targets. And even if investors aren't leaving, well, lenders might be considering, and they have been seen to consider, well, the risks associated to lending to firms that might be regulated away in 10 years, or might not have a business model in 15 years. So you see in both in the investing and in the lending sphere, this sort of tip away from high intensity oil and gas producers. And then so the other was financial regulation, right? So regulators are increasingly, they have a small appetite for firms that have a lot of climate risk associated with them. They're required to hold more capital in some cases. And then in the future, there could be litigation risk, and that's also a financial risk. So, the real implications are financial implications.
That's interesting, because just this morning, Canada's banking regulator, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, announced the creation of a climate forum. So, I mean, your comments are right on point in terms of the regulatory and legal risks and other risks. What developments in the investor community might encourage a faster pace?
Yeah, so sometimes I'm not envious of the investor community, because there's a lot of information out there about firms' emissions, about their targets, about whether or not they're meeting them. But there's also a lot of, I don't want to call it misinformation, but there's also just sometimes information that isn't very useful. And so one of the things that I think that the investor community can do to sort of speed it up is to require more disclosure, require more clear disclosure from the individual firms, and then for the firms to tie, I would say, governance, the pay of executives, individuals, to setting a target and actually meeting an individual target. So I think putting pressure on, we need more good information, and we need to have our targets and our goals really tied to things that managers and firms really care about, which is sort of pay and governance. And I think that would be a really good way for them to vote with their dollars. And I'm not a huge fan of divestment only. I think there are a lot of steps that you can go on leading up to divestment. And so I think being an active investor and sort of pushing the climate agenda, I think, is much more useful than just threatening to divest, which is something you can do, but maybe as a last resort.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us today. And now let's do a deeper dive into some of the hurdles and strategies that businesses can use for net zero success. I'd like to welcome to the stage Angie Lamarche, Head of Sustainable Finance for Commercial Banking with HSBC Bank Canada. Welcome, Angie. Have a seat. And joining us virtually from Vancouver is Cora Strandberg, President of Strandberg Consulting, which helps businesses shape the right sustainability and ESG strategies. Welcome, Cora. Do we have Cora? Okay, there we are. Excellent. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to join Angie on stage here. And Angie, let's start with you. We just heard Ryan talk about how Canadian businesses are not necessarily as far along as their peers in the European Union, as an example, when it comes to climate targets. To start us off, could you outline what you see as the top challenges for businesses when they embark on programs such as Net Zero?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, first to pull back, appreciating this is an event on net zero. A common challenge we find out of the gate when we're connecting with clients of all sizes across the country really is that sustainability is larger than just climate. And so it's that piece of work with businesses to identify what are the most material considerations and what will those opening priorities be. And where the common thread certainly is climate and emissions. I think a couple of key challenges that we see across the market. The first is, as Ryan alluded to, the regulatory environment within Canada is less advanced than it is in other parts of the world. So some of the clarity around what's being asked of different businesses is constantly evolving and is not entirely user-friendly at all times, and can lead into the second challenge, particularly not user-friendly for those who might not be coming with a strong sustainability background or core skill set, and the talent gap and the really the human capital gap that we see in terms of accessibility of folks to those businesses who are large enough to build out sustainability teams, and then the even larger challenge for smaller and mid-sized companies of being able to afford the right talent to be able to help them build a strategy and then execute. And then the last piece I'll really pick up on is data. It's, again, with the evolving space, it's been inconsistent what data folks are being asked to collect. And for those who are collecting, when you think about kind of core challenges around other data that you might be reporting out into the market, there's that expectation of controls in place for normal financial audit standards. And having that level of control in place for data collection on sustainability metrics, I would say is a particular challenge for many businesses in Canada.
Okay, so Angie, just staying with you for a moment. We've heard a lot about greenwashing. It's been in the news a lot in the last year. But you've also pointed to a term called green hushing. Let's just start off with, what does that mean? And then I have a follow-up question for you.
So I think everyone's familiar with greenwashing at this point, but if anyone isn't, really it's the idea of a claim or a statement that's being made that is believed to be inaccurate to the actual underlying work that's going on at a simple level. As a result of the risks of greenwashing, the perception that we're advancing towards a net zero future or a more sustainable future when really we're not, there's been a lot of increased focus across the media, across activist groups, and really in the corporate space as well, to call out some of this greenwashing behavior. Now, the challenge is obviously this exists on a spectrum, and the reputational risk for organizations is clear and is often quite front of mind for management teams. And so the term green hushing has really started to rise to prominence as the idea of really management groups sitting back and avoiding being perceived as leaders, not avoiding being perceived as leaders, but avoiding putting statements out into the market that may run additional risk of attracting attention from folks who would put out accusations of greenwashing. And so the major concern here is that even if the work is still being done in the background, which is fantastic, I don't think we've seen green hushing really slow down climate strategy yet. A lot of the progress we've made in sustainability has been based on collaboration, whether it's within industry groups or between diverse stakeholders such as lenders, corporates, suppliers, and where folks aren't being public about their climate ambitions or their climate commitments, it becomes a much more challenging environment to identify ways in which to collaborate, and that's where that sort of hushing idea of a bit of a silencing across industry comes from.
And so when you think of those two trends, greenwashing and green hushing, what does that, help? Why are businesses hesitating then? You've sort of talked about that, but I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit more color on why they might be hesitating on climate targets.
Certainly the reputational risk around disclosing a target and then having to either walk back data. We thought that we had baselined our emissions accurately, but it turns out our data was poor. It is a reputational risk, and where you have investors, where you have regulators, where you have lenders looking at this data, it's not a surprise that management teams want to feel fully confident in what they're putting out into the market. And oftentimes management teams for who this is a new topic as well. And so that level of uncertainty and insecurity with the content, I think feeds a level of uncertainty around making public disclosures. And so looking at sort of the path forward and the glass half full approach, I think what businesses really need to be thinking about is transparency in reporting. So where you're reporting out on baseline emissions or any other kind of data, being really clear about where there are gaps in the process, acknowledging that you're working on this is an interim target that's being set based on a perceived pathway to net zero 2050 or whatever the case is, but with that healthy level of acknowledgement that we don't have everything right just yet, and we're continuing to develop and refine our processes to ensure that the data just gets better.
Okay, Coro, your area of expertise is ESG. As businesses are trying to measure and manage their emissions, one of the challenges they face is emissions from their full value chain, from suppliers right down to the end customer. Why is that so complex?
Yes, well, thank you for fielding that question to me. It's an area of great interest of mine. First to put this into context, we'll hear more about ways of measuring emissions, I'm sure, over the course of the day, but there's scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are your operational emissions, where you would have direct control over them. And then there's scope 3 emissions, which are those emissions that are found in your value chain, as you've said, with your suppliers upstream or downstream, customers, your distribution channels, transportation channels, et cetera, that you don't own. And we find that, as the data shows, most emissions of companies are actually in the value chain. On average, of 75% of carbon emissions of a company are in their value chain, upwards to 98%. So this is something that all companies have to wrestle with, and to get to net zero, companies will have to focus there. And we know that it's impossible to become net zero working in isolation. It's not possible. You will need to work with your supply chain, with your customers, and be involved in collaboration with them. So some of the challenges of this is that you don't have direct control over those in your value chain. You can't tell them what to do. You don't know who your suppliers are, perhaps, or you might not know who your customers are, and there's challenges with databases and other things to be able to qualify them and understand who they are. And you also don't know which of your suppliers or your customers are biggest emitters. This is the work that needs to be done at the front end in order to prioritize and then start to collaborate. So those are just some of the challenges that companies face when they start to work on their scope 3 emissions in their value chain.
Okay, so Cora, on the flip side of that question is, what are the approaches that are actually proving to be effective?
Yes, well, fortunately, there are many strategies at hand. An obvious one is sustainable procurement, where you would have a sustainable procurement policy in which you would have specifications and criteria for your suppliers if they're bidding on opportunities to work with your firm, where you would incentivize them and specify lower carbon alternatives either of your the products that you're sourcing, or you might even be asking your supplier to share with you what they're doing on reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions. Do they have a policy to go net zero? What are their plans? So there's a few options under sustainable procurement. Another approach that's effective to help your customers reduce their carbon emissions is product innovation. To start to rethink the products that you're offering to reduce what is called the embedded carbon of your products that's inherent in the product that you're offering, and offer lower carbon options to your customers, which of course involves R&D and innovation, and is quite a significant opportunity for customers to, for companies to grow revenues with their new carbon reduced product line, if you will. And then of course, there's supplier, customer, and industry collaboration and engagement. So beyond just specifying or requiring low carbon options, or beyond selling customers lower carbon alternatives, what about the opportunity of collaborating with your suppliers, of collaborating with your customers, and collaborating with your industry, perhaps through your industry association? So this is, of course, where you would start to reach out to those in your value chain, set up working groups or round tables or brainstorms, co-innovation, and start to work together and collaborate on the solutions that are needed to reduce the carbon footprint.
So this is great because, I mean, while there are a number of challenges, I'm also hearing a number of opportunities for businesses as well to help tackle this issue. Angie, you talked about data and how that topic keeps coming up again and again when we talk about climate targets, and especially when it comes to reporting. What success strategies are you seeing among businesses that you work with that are actually gathering good quality data?
I think, like with anything that's data-driven, understanding what you're trying to achieve before you start is often quite a key pillar of success. And there are a few different examples. I think Coro really hit the nail on the head in terms of the challenge and the opportunity of working with supply chain. And so many of our customers, with a little bit of work, are able to collect data on their own operations. When you look at something like retail apparel, where you've got 96% of your emissions coming from the supply chain, and you're talking about largely overseas suppliers who are facing all sorts of different challenges and incentives, how do you work as an industry group? How do you work as an organization to really collect data and then influence behaviors in those areas? So I'd say some key strategies we see from customers that have been successful here: clearly define the outcome, and define it in something that's manageable from the start. And so a lot of these solutions can scale upon themselves, but if you haven't collected your own data, tackling supply chain first is likely to be a bit of a significant challenge there. I think partnering with folks in your industry, asking your lenders, asking other key stakeholders what kind of data they're interested in seeing from you. As was alluded to by Ryan, certainly the lending community, the investor community, the financial markets as a whole have a lot of content available now, and a lot of support that can be provided to businesses to help educate around where the priorities are sitting and where we see the markets evolving over time, and what might be coming to your industry. For example, at HSBC, obviously we have clear insights into what's being asked from the European markets, and we really have seen that trend of evolution of regulatory disclosure requirements from Europe into Canada. So those are all kind of key considerations that come to mind for myself. And then really aligning the organization. Where we see success is not where you have one individual sat within a sustainability team trying to collect all of this data. It's where the organization has been pulled together to all be involved. So you've got a cross-functional team that's owning sustainability. You've operational folks who are on the ground in a manufacturing plant who understand the importance of quality data collection, alongside those right up the value chain or up the organization who might be working ultimately in disclosure or in different capacities working with this information. I think product innovation is another great one. Where you have good information that you can provide to your product teams, they can make more informed choices around how to innovate and how to position products in the market.
Coro, you have some great examples of traditional businesses that have really done a good job of embracing climate action. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, actually, maybe I'll try to work in two here to feature different aspects of climate action, and really lifting off the earlier point I was making about value chain engagement and collaboration, this idea you can't become net zero working on your own. So one example is Hemlock Printers, which is a social purpose company whose purpose is to conserve the world's forests, and they have a very strong net zero carbon ambition. And what they've been doing over the past few years is, first they started by engaging with their mills that provide the paper to them, looking to see if their mills could provide more low carbon option paper and more FSC certified paper. And they were successful in that. So now they have more of their mills providing this type of paper that they use for their print jobs. So then they turn to their customers. And they've been talking to their customers about, would you be interested in using this lower carbon alternative? And their customers are interested because they too are trying to go net zero. So what Hemlock Printers has been able to do is create like a full value chain concept by having got the product from their suppliers, reformatting it and making it available to their customers. They call this a zero, I think they call it Zero, a customer product that they make available. And what they're doing is they're encouraging their customers to create demand with the suppliers so that there is more supply of these low carbon alternatives. And they're also working within their industry association, where they're going to take their proprietary program and make it available to the Canadian and American printing industry. So all printers can adopt this zero carbon product for their customers and drive more demand from their mills. So that's kind of a complete package solution and an example of working within the industry. And the other example, just maybe a bit of a shorter one I'll share with you, is Lafarge Canada, another social purpose company whose purpose is to build better cities, if you will. And they have their own net zero targets and commitments. But what they've done is they've worked it directly, like Hemlock, with their industry association, because they realize they can't go to get to low carbon cement without collaboration with their competitors. And so working through the Canadian Cement Association, the CEO sits on the board, I think even might be the chair of the board, and the Cement Association has recently adopted a plan to accelerate the entire sector's actions towards net zero concrete. And this is actually where we need to drive to, is working within the sector, the value chain in the sector, to shift whole sectors towards net zero. So this is an example of one company working within the industry association to support a shift to net zero right across their industry.
If I can pick up on that, I think another example that's interesting is how you can use sustainability and data to drive new business opportunities. And so something we've seen from a customer who works in the recycling space and has operated a traditional recycling business, charging customers based on volumes, has now started a new revenue stream where they're selling the data of what's been achieved through the recycling back to their customers with a quality level, with a traceability level of quality, such that their customers are able to leverage that data into their own disclosures. So also for small and medium businesses, it's not necessarily just what you're facing or where you're facing direct pressure and how to mitigate risks, but it's also looking at your customer base and saying, are there key commitments that my customers are making that my operations can actually enable them to achieve? And how can I monetize that to help make my business model more resilient and really help drive growth while also supporting better sustainability accomplishments across the industry?
Angie, let's talk a bit about reporting on climate targets, the progress that companies are making. It's really an alphabet soup of terms and methods and standards. How are business leaders navigating that complexity?
It's a challenge, and it's something we hear frequently from our customers. It seems like a never-ending list of different standards that are emerging, and in some sectors you do see clear expectations. I would say in the financial industry, TCFD is the expectation of where reporting is getting aligned, as well as within the energy space. There's a lot of optimism about ISSB, and I mean the headquarter in Montreal is certainly exciting to see, I think, for all of us in the Canadian market. But there is that ongoing challenge, and so what I do recommend to leaders is, if there's not an explicit requirement for you, if you're publicly traded, obviously aligning to what the CSA or the SEC or your relevant market is requiring of you, just keeping it back to basics. You know, what are those important metrics? Are you collecting quality data? And from there, being able to build to the path to whatever is the most appropriate disclosure for your industry. Because we've heard from a number of folks now, with chief sustainability officers and others, that, oh my goodness, we've looked at where we're dedicating our resources, and most of our team is spending most of their time working on disclosure as opposed to actually implementing solutions that are going to help improve the sustainability impact of our business.
Cara, I want you to weigh in on this one as well. What are some ESG best practices for business?
ESG best practices for business. So that's now a more holistic question. What I'm finding that the leaders in ESG are starting to move towards, and ESG, by the way, stands for environment, social, governance. That hasn't been introduced yet, but what I'm finding the leaders are starting to move towards actually adopting a social purpose is the reason their business exists. And I mentioned Hemlock Printers and Lafarge Canada as two examples of that. And a social purpose business is a business whose reason for being is to create a better world. So this is a great fit with organizations that are pursuing net zero, because those that are trying to create a better world through their business. And if you weren't interested in that, you probably wouldn't be pursuing net zero. And mind you, you'd have HSBC and the regulators after you if you don't. But many companies are moving in this direction because they see the imperative and want to improve conditions in society. And so the examples we're talking about today, the product innovation, the supply chain innovation, the industry collaboration and innovation, this is all about mobilizing the resources of firms to help society tackle its challenges. And of course, climate change is an existential challenge, but other ESG companies who are moving to adopt social purposes as the reason they exist, they might have a different kind of a social purpose. I'm working with one company whose social purpose is to address income inequality, as an example. So there's these different types of social purposes, and basically what the organization does is bring all of their assets, resources, influence, reach, and scale to address the societal challenge that is their purpose. And pretty well all of these organizations are really seeking to transform their industry. So we're really opening up a collective project where the business sees itself a part of society, not apart from society. And so I think we're really at the beginnings of a revolution, I think, in business, playing this more visionary role, if you will. And we need them, to be allies on the quest to net zero and these other social purpose ambitions.
Okay, I always have lots of questions, but I want to know, there are questions from people in the room. I see a hand up right there. Just hold on a second, wait for the mic to come to you.
I hope my voice can be heard.
Oh, well, there's a mic right there. We want to make sure that the people on the virtual audience can hear you as well.
Thank you very much. I will admit on this topic I am somewhat agnostic in that I don't profess to have a great deal of expertise. But listening to the speakers, including the first speaker, my question is, we are a small country, Canada. We are a do-gooder nation without any status epistemic. We have a prime minister who likes to talk, but no one takes him seriously. So this is a larger, granular issue. I will admit I spend a great deal of time abroad with a very large public institution where all I'm trying to do is least harm. But when it comes down to climate change and value neutral, it's a question of enforceability in terms of ethics. But when we look at India, we look at China, and then we cross-point it to emerging nations in sub-Saharan Africa, there is what I call a discordance. And listening to your conversation, I was reminded by the infamous article by Milton Friedman many, many decades ago, which led to CSR, corporate social responsibility, which we're still talking about. So my question to you is, talk is nice, and it's important that we're talking, but how can one go more than that? Because the world is changing, and the majority of people that inhabit this world are living day by day, and the most precious resource in the near future, if not now, is water. And water is going to be the new power. Those that lack are going to be without, and they may take. Thank you.
Okay, Angie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the question, and I think what I really appreciate about you bringing up water is expanding the conversation beyond climate. I think climate is clearly a critically important aspect of sustainability, and I think it's something that folks can very quickly wrap their minds around. We think about the wildfires we've seen in the past 30 days in this country. It's hard not to have a tangible personal experience with climate, but it's not the only important sustainability conversation out there. I think what fills me with an incredible amount of optimism, I've been in banking for 10 years. I've been in this role for 2, and previously was a director in our large corporate banking team based out of Vancouver. And the pace of change in the conversations that I'm having with business leaders is astronomical. Some of it is tied to the regulatory environment. Some of our customers are responding to the floor that's being picked up politically, to investor pressure, and to others. But many are seeing the opportunity alongside. And so I think there's obviously a need for government here, for policymakers globally, to ensure that there's a consistent approach. I think the more that we can give people credible carbon floors in terms of pricing, it really helps to move the market. I think you look at solutions like credible carbon trading markets. It's obviously a bit of a Wild West space today, but the evolution is happening in real time. The conversations I'm having with the same customers are changing month over month, and folks that a year ago were saying, this isn't really my circus to play in, are now saying, you know what, I don't have to own the whole solution to acknowledge that there is a role for me to play here, both to manage risk and to leverage opportunity for my business and for my community. And so it's really interesting to see how different organizations and different management teams have different stakeholder groups that are the most important drivers for their behavior. But I would say consistently, coast to coast to coast, from our smallest businesses to our largest, what we're seeing from our customer base is a huge appetite for knowledge and for real solutions to help them be a part of the transition to a low carbon economy, as well as, most importantly, a more sustainable future. So it's not a small task. I think when you look at the grand macro scale of the challenge that you've laid out, it can be very overwhelming for individuals. But as you break it down and think about where you can make incremental change, whether your primary motivation out of the gate is reducing the operating costs to heat and cool your buildings, or whether you're looking to have a real impact on a specific sustainability outcome, there is increasingly just alignment across the economy to help be a part of this journey and to help really drive transformation for society.
Okay, and I feel I have to jump in on this. Sorry about that. But I totally concur with Angie. And what I am seeing, I've been in this business for 30 years. I have never seen, talk about walking the talk, I have never seen the acceleration towards the transition. We used to say, when should we do this? And now it's like, how should we do this? And so there's been a real change in perspective, and the acceleration is quite dramatic. And just 2 other points to surface, because you were talking about social questions as well. And what we're seeing is companies being concerned about what's called a just transition, measures to ensure that there's no one left behind in the pivot to low carbon. And another venture that companies are pursuing is the circular economy, where they are ensuring that they are reducing their impact on biodiversity and reducing their waste and basically closing the loop on their operations. So these are some other rapidly moving forces at play, and Canada is among the leaders in advancing these topics as well.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. The time just flew by. Thank you, Angie and Coro, for taking the time to share your insights with us today. And And now I'd like to hand things off to my colleague, Jordan Chitley, for the next session.
Thanks, Rita. That was great. Very interesting. I'm Jordan Chitley. I'm the editor of Globe Drive. Sustainable transportation and mobility is a topic that we cover a lot in the pages of print now and online and in my section. So I'm very excited to be moderating the panel today. We just heard about the myriad challenges facing businesses. Now we're really going to zero in on one industry. The transportation sector is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for almost a quarter of the nation's emissions. But a lot of that is changing, and it is an industry that is a part of most governments' plans for reducing emissions. We have two experts here today to talk about them, so let's introduce them. First up is Stephen Beattie, Vice President and Corporate Secretary with Toyota Canada. And we have Lauren Tedesco, Senior Vice President with the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association.
Excellent.
Lauren,
Thank you.
welcome to you both. All right, so some of the first cars, way back 150 years ago, did not run on gas. But for the majority of the last 130 years, we've been using gas to fuel our cars. And now we are going to rapidly switch away from that. Stephen, how do you think the industry is doing?
Well, I think the industry has been doing actually pretty well in the sense that there's been an incredible amount of technological advances over the last few years. And I look now, it's been over 20 years since we put our first hybrid technology into the marketplace. Today, half of the vehicles we sell in Canada are either hybrid, plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or fuel cell electric. And you can see that manufacturer by manufacturer, that those technologies are moving into the market very rapidly. The challenge is going to be, as governments have started to catch up with the whole issue of what should the next technology be, it's turned kind of binary. And what I mean by that is that it's sort of turned battery electric or nothing. And by doing that, it's going to send a number of shocks through the system that will require very rapid turnover in supply chains, a massive investment in certain types of technologies. And here's what I know. If you try to push the market too far ahead of its normal adoption curve, prices will go up, vehicles will be in relatively short supply, and there are going to be consequences as we look at the next few years. And the very first big target is 2030, which is, in our terms, one model away from today. So it's a massive change. It requires action across multiple fronts. And at the end of this, if we're able to produce the vehicles, the question is a Canadian driver prepared to pay the price for the types of technologies we'll deliver to the market?
And you're, of course, talking about the targets targets and penalties that heavily favor battery electric vehicles as opposed to any other kind of emissions reducing technology.
Well, that's right. So it's tilted very much in favor of battery electric technology over fuel cells, over low carbon fuels, over any of the other sorts of technologies we might deploy. And the result then is that you not only have to have a minerals to mobility strategy in place that allows you to get the raw materials into the supply chain to build up to the roughly 2 million vehicles that we need in Canada every year. But at the same time, unlike gasoline-powered vehicles where the infrastructure already exists, you're going to have a reliable deployment of electricity across the grid and charging infrastructure in place everywhere that somebody takes a car. And there are a lot of environments that just really are not set up for that today.
So what should the government do differently?
Well, I would say that when we started looking at how we wanted to make the transition, our view was you have to look at energy and transportation together. And unfortunately, the two policy areas have been split. So from our standpoint, our view was pick the right technology for the right application and the right customer. So what I mean by that, for example, is if you're looking at heavy duty transportation, probably fuel cell vehicles make the most sense because they can be fueled up quickly, they don't have a lot of weight associated with the powertrain technology, and in transporting goods, that weight penalty and any time out of cycle is very important. On the small vehicle side, battery electric vehicles make a lot of sense here in Canada. But in between and across a lot of different applications, a hybrid vehicle running on low carbon fuel might be the appropriate choice. We haven't allowed for those streams. We've allowed for one, basically.
Lauren, Stephen touched on something, including the supply chain, that you discuss a lot in your work. And your work also focuses on skills and the skills needed by the workforce. So what will need to change with the workforce to produce cars differently? And what skills are these workers going to need to have?
So I think taking a step back, which I've heard a few other speakers do the same thing to provide some context, looking at the state of the world right now in terms of climate. I think it's announced today, June 19th, exactly 2 years since Lytton out in BC. Wildfire sparked and totally destroyed a town, and today, 2 years later, the state of emergency was lifted. These are people who may not even come back to live where they did because they've now uprooted somewhere else for the last 2 years. So seeing that climate change in context, seeing it happen, it's yes, globally, but that always seems far removed, but seeing it right here in Canada, those are the kind of day-to-day things that are always on people's minds. Whether you're taking it to work or you're thinking about your children at school, it doesn't matter. This is no longer just one, small segment. It's really looking at our commute and the decisions that we're making in business. Some of those challenges, especially in the supply chain that we talk about, in automotive, there really are no borders when we look across North America. Things pass over multiple times to the US, to Mexico, and back. It is borderless. But when we look at the influence that governments have, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, based out of the US, there's $370 billion investment under the Biden administration that makes Canada have to compete in this space. Because if we don't, we start losing companies, we start losing our manufacturers. There's head offices already in the US or in Mexico. We see them take their jobs there. We see then workers in our small communities across Ontario specifically, but even coast to coast, start to lose that as well. So we have to look at the opportunities. I know that we could sit up here and say a lot of the hardships that will happen as we meet some of these, or try to meet some of these very aggressive targets, especially by 2035, to have light duty vehicles be zero emission. Will we get there? Maybe. Will we achieve it in that time frame? Probably not. But part of that has to be the buy-in, not just of shareholders and not just of customers, but workers. They are the ones showing up every day on the production line, especially our shop floor workers who are showing up to transition. There's about 100,000 in the auto parts manufacturing sector in Canada. 30% of those are directly working on parts for internal combustion engines. So fuel tanks, injectors, exhaust, transmissions, those jobs are directly affected, 30,000 people. They will have to transition. And part of that is that if a company, we can make a decision. Are you going to play along the margins like we've done probably for the past 30 plus years as governments set new mandates and have new segments of the climate that they want to target? Or are you going to lead? If you lead or resist, it's going to be the same amount of work either way. And I think in order to get that buy-in, especially from the workforce, especially if you're asking people who have spent generations in automotive to step up, to change the nature of their work, to learn new skills, to really have to make adjustments to what their work looks like, and you don't want them to leave for another sector, that buy-in has to happen across all levels if you want them to start upskilling and training and really moving towards meeting those targets that a lot of our manufacturing customers have to do already, probably started a couple years ago, and will have to continue to adjust over the next 10 to 15.
So Lauren, from where you sit, is upskilling workers one of the biggest challenges that your organization will face as we head towards net zero, or,
yes.
Or what is the biggest challenge?
Definitely. So, automotive, it's probably much like a lot of advanced manufacturing. We have people in our workforce, there's multiple generations. We have a generation that has probably spent the past 25 to 30 years working in manufacturing or assembly plants, who have spent their whole career there, who it's probably a family affair at this point, generation after generation, and they're leaving. They're retiring and they're taking that knowledge with them. So like a lot of others, there's a huge gap because of the labor shortage. We can't fill in fast enough to be able to transition. We also have a middle generation who have maybe, spent some time in manufacturing, are deciding whether is automotive for them, could they move into another role somewhere else? And we're seeing a lot of the manufacturers, the owners of those small and medium-sized businesses especially, thinking about how they keep those people and how do we make sure that training is not daunting and upskilling either. Something that we do at the APMA, we, at the beginning of this year, unveiled Project Arrow. So Project Arrow is Canada's first zero-emission, all-electric, autonomous vehicle. We went out to our suppliers, I think over 500 and something came forward to say, we want to build a car. We want to build Canada's first all-Canadian. We want to show the world that not just what we can do, but the potential of what we can do in the creativity, and that we have one of the most educated workforces in the G7. I believe we're at the top still. And so what can that potential look like? Not just demonstrating our technology and the potential of what our manufacturers do right now. We ask them to be creative. We ask them to do things, look at biometrics in the steering wheel and looking at a solar capture roof and carbon capture on the front. All of these pieces also tie back to our workforce. And without that innovation, without that creativity, we're not driving people to stay. And I think that's the conversation, not just what it looks like at the leadership levels or the decisions around technology or the decisions around the market. How do you make sure people stay and they want to stay? So upskilling, training, no question, that is a huge piece. People want the power in their own hands to make the decisions, to feel they have control of their future. They want to know what a career path looks like amongst this change, and especially, partnering with colleges and universities, because it's a bit of the Wild West with micro-credentials. We're not sticking to standard curriculum anymore. We have a lot more flexibility between industry and post-secondary to really address that head-on, and that's already happening.
Stephen, what would you say is one of the biggest challenges from a Toyota standpoint?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things. The first thing I would say is I just think the regulators have got it wrong. And the reason I would say that is that what you're seeing, and the IRA is a good example of this, it's not actually about the environment. It's about economic challenges with China. And it incidentally has been packaged as a way to drive down carbon emissions. The point of this is that if you started from a proposition that said, hey, we want to get carbon emissions their lowest, you then look sector by sector at the right technologies to make that happen, and you wouldn't have separated energy and transportation policy the way that North America seems to have done. So my issue is the government's well within its rights to establish whatever targets it wants to set. And it's now not only doing that, but it's also saying exactly how you'll get there. So the challenge then is to change corporate strategies in a way that align with those regulatory requirements and ensure that you can do it by the timelines. Because here in Canada, for example, we're regulated under environmental protection, and the result of those standards are that it's actually a criminal offense not only to miss your target, but to plan to miss a target. So there is absolutely no choice. We will hit the requirements that the industry is meant to hit. The question is at what cost and with what scale of manufacturing on the ground here in Canada. And so what I would be arguing for is a couple of things. One is ensure that if these are in fact the pathways that Canadians want to take, that you're doing your utmost to be able to bring new sources of supply on stream fast. And to the extent that it takes 10 years to bring a mine into production, we're talking about 2030 without that supply chain being in place to allow us to hit those targets. So what do we have to do under those circumstances? I think we end up looking at sourcing abroad for some of those materials. And yet, again, you have public policy that's saying that we want to divorce ourselves from Chinese supply or other sources of raw materials or parts or inputs. Okay. So what's the priority target here? Is it to achieve the environmental objectives? If it is, I think we know how to get there. If it's to do environmental objectives while chasing other targets, I think that becomes enormously complex and very difficult to achieve. And you know, as I said, here we are. It's 2023. We don't have a final ZEV policy at the federal level. It's supposed to have its first year of effect in 26 and be at a point where we're at 60% zero-emission vehicles by 2030. So to achieve that type of a result is sort of akin to, you know, the 1960s and putting somebody on the moon in terms of turning over the technologies and creating a new environment for mobility here in Canada. We need everybody pulling in the same direction.
I have to ask you about some big news Toyota made last week. It seemed like it was a bit of a strategic pivot to invest more in electric vehicles, which would align Toyota more with some of the other manufacturers and also government policy. And the stock price shot up as a result of it. So what does that mean for Toyota Canada and drivers in Canada? Or am I reading that a bit wrong?
I think you're reading it a bit wrong. And what we actually did was we republished some material that we'd used with global media a number of months ago in talking about the multiple pathways that we were going to use in different countries around the world. And keep in mind that Toyota operates in about 180 different countries around the world. So the type of infrastructure, the fuels, the electric supply, et cetera, that we need country by country varies quite dramatically. And you know, personal disposable income obviously is very different in Africa to downtown Toronto. So how you achieve these things means that you have to deploy different types of technologies. I think we have been clear in our own terms about how we were going to apply those different technologies. I suspect we haven't been clear enough for some folks. What happened last week was, one, the reveal of a number of new technologies that we'll be bringing to market over the next several years, which is
solid-state batteries.
Solid-state batteries for one.
Almost a holy grail of what we need to really put EVs.
So what we announced was that, you know, in this next electric vehicle platform, we would have a vehicle with 1,000 kilometers of all-electric range. But that was one piece of news. We also talked about our new hydrogen factory. We talked about working on zero carbon fuels and a host of other technologies. And I think at the end of the day, shareholders in Japan in particular, because keep in mind that battery electric vehicles don't necessarily work well in the Japanese context. I think shareholders responded well to just the clarity around what was the plan that gets you to the future.
Thanks. Lauren, I've seen reports that clean energy jobs could actually be significantly more than the amount of energy jobs we have now. Do you think something similar could be on the way for the auto sector? Like, could there be more jobs of people making electric motors or batteries or any sort of clean fuel technology than we currently have now?
So I think it'll be twofold. I think that we will see a lot of jobs transition and then new jobs come in as well, especially as we shift towards looking, like Stephen said, the future is a bit unknown. We have picked one path that could potentially change. And so what 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now looks like, that will definitely set the tone. And then I think on the other side, when looking at manufacturing, people too often think about, you know, probably the B-roll that you see on TV of people in a facility, you know, on an assembly line. But, you know, these are really state-of-the-art facilities. I've been to a Toyota tour. I tell everyone to go on the tour because it is very eye-opening into what really the epitome of the industry looks like. And that will also shift as well because, you know, we have members that are now, that really looked at Ontario because this is where manufacturing was taking place, but now as we look into expanding those technologies and looking at AI and looking at autonomous vehicles, there are new startups every day. There are new companies coming forward, there's new technology, there's new software, and so our reach continues to expand into places that we didn't really anticipate probably 10 years ago. And so those investments, looking at like Volkswagen Volkswagen and LG Stellantis. These are really changing the nature of that as well. Because we are attracting more investments here, because those jobs are increasing substantially, it's a fantastic time to be in automotive. And yes, this is me pitching to everyone, come to automotive, but it really is, because that change is happening so quickly, and because we're seeing big companies, had we not landed some of those investments, they would have probably landed in the US, or they could have landed in Mexico, and that would have drawn jobs down there. Strengthening that supply chain here in Canada, right from critical minerals all the way down through the process, that's really what is important for a lot of our small and medium-sized businesses. Also, just to kind of pivot to the conversation around government and kind of setting that tone, working with government, especially, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, you are highly regulated from government. You have a driver's license, your car has a VIN, you drive in the lanes on the road. It doesn't matter kind of what that, your relationship with it might be, but it does continue to impact the work that we do. And I think it's really important that as these conversations happen, or as, political parties change power. Right now we're in a fantastic spot where we have the provincial Conservatives working really well with the federal Liberals, and we see those announcements taking place, and we see those partnerships and those conversations that wouldn't normally happen. I think attracting investments into this country continues to not only strengthen automotive, but then strengthen our stature as well. This is why we are able to have a seat at the table, and this is why we're able to have more strong workers here and investment in those spaces. I come from a previous life in government, so full disclosure, but does anyone know the work of Treasury Board? Probably not. But here's a place where a lot of decisions are made, and where they're the expenditure management. This is where, it doesn't matter what your organization does, you should be at the table having a conversation. It won't always go your way, but it's important that your voice is there. And I think that's the translation for a lot of this too. Rather than government setting policy and everyone else being reactionary, it's that governments will continue to change, and so will leaders at the top of organizations. But being in those conversations, understanding how those decisions are made, understanding why they're made, and it's probably part of a bigger policy or a bigger mandate. But that translation between government and between corporations, I think a lot of conversations, oftentimes, people are missing out on those. So I think that's also a significant role, because you want to understand how to plan for your business and what it will mean for your workforce and your production lines, and what your product will look like in the next couple of years.
I want to ask one more question to each of you, and then hopefully we have time for an audience question or two, and it's actually going to be the same question. I want to end with some success stories that you've seen, maybe even a hopeful note here. Stephen, what is one success story that you want to share about Toyota or the industry, and what lessons do you think others could take away from that?
Well, I want to go back to where we are today. As I said, about 50% of our sales at the moment are electrified products. And the result of that means that we've got a very good base on which to build. But if I could give you a second space where I'm very encouraged, and it's something that for the most part's unseen here in Toronto, and that is the amount of thinking that's going on in Western Canada around energy reforms. And if you can think about everything that we're doing to bring technology and new vehicles, that'll get you zero emissions from anything new that comes into the marketplace. The problem is there are 26 million vehicles already on the road. And there's some really interesting work happening in the West now on direct air capture of carbon. And with carbon, historic carbon pulled out of the air, bonded with hydrogen, you create long chain molecules and a fuel that essentially can replace any gasoline or diesel in any conventional engine on the road. So if we make the right investments in the right places, the impacts on carbon emissions can be incredible. And the industry, both on the energy side and on transportation, are just on the edge of some major breakthroughs.
Lauren, same question to you.
I would say one of the biggest successes, and I'll only go back to Project Arrow because I think that really captures what our industry is doing. So often people look at it, meeting quotas, doing the day-to-day, but we have not done a fantastic job of marketing what career paths look like across automotive. You could not ask a kid in a school right now, you want a job as with cars, they're probably talking about selling cars or designing cars, but there's no specific pathway like you would be a police officer or a teacher. And so, just as much as Project Arrow has been looking at, I think there's now 60 suppliers on the car, and Toyota has also been one of our biggest supporters and our only OEM on the vehicle, is also about getting this out to students. We took it to a couple of schools. Kids told us they don't want a Lamborghini, they want Project Arrow. And I thought that was a massive win because my kids are drawing Lamborghinis day in and day out. But it gave them kind of that spark of interest, because talking to them will never work. Showing them on the ground is what will change that. And they don't understand that this is where the future is, and there will be self-driving cars, and we'll get to the Jetsons at some point later, but I think that's the real success here, is that how do you spark the interest of the next generation, because our job is only to pass along a better world to them, whatever that looks like in the capacity, but to spark that and to get them interested in things that will help change their future. So honestly, I can't believe I'm ending this with, but yes, we're handing it over to the kids, so yes.
Do we have time for an audience question? Oh, yes, sir.
The question I put myself through university with my uncle's moving company in Halifax, and his success was adding another semi-trailer to the fleet. And I had the privilege of operating those. But I'm curious because I saw recently a truck driver saying, if I go to a battery truck, the weight of the engine is as much as the weight of the thing I'm hauling. So you mentioned fuel cells and hydrogen, and I'm curious where you see, because it's an interest of mine, where, although that's not what I do in the zero economy, where the propelling, you mentioned fuel cells, I'm not aware of those. I'm aware of hydrogen. In fact, this summer I hope to see the CP's mainline engine in Calgary that they're using hydrogen to fuel. And that made sense, because if you drive the 401 anytime before 6 in the morning, where I think every semi-trailer goes into a hole somewhere, the 401 is basically taken over by the trucking industry.
Right. So, we announced a recent partnership in the heavy-duty trucking industry in North America, and we're going into production in our Kentucky factory of modules that will be built specifically for heavy-duty transport. The point about this is that unlike batteries, which are heavy, essentially you need to add that second trailer in order to be able to move your full cargo. Hydrogen's very light, and it can be compressed and held in tanks. And so the refueling time for hydrogen, as well as the cargo capacity and impact on payback on payload is very high. Obviously, just like battery electrics, the issue is infrastructure. We need fueling points across the country, but because these are long-range vehicles, you need to build relatively few along major thoroughfares. So we think that's the first place that you'll see significant deployment of hydrogen technology. But to your earlier point, don't discount direct combustion of hydrogen, because again, the only byproduct's water. And so if you can produce green hydrogen, it's a chemical building block for a lot of different things, and it provides you with fuels that can be moved in a world where the grid itself is quite constrained.
Were there any other audience questions? In the back corner over there.
I have just one simple question. I don't know whether it is Mickey Mouse to introduce, or whether it's rocket science not to be implemented. We have conventional cars, a lot of conventional cars still. We have electric cars trying to take off. I often wonder, on the roof of the car, can we incorporate either one of those with a solar panel so that they become, hybrid gas or hybrid electric? That's my question.
So in some markets, we already provide a solar roof on our hybrids, but the problem with it is solar panels just aren't that efficient in terms of their ability to create electricity over that amount of area on top of the car. So it takes a very long time to get a significant charge out of it. So what it's best at doing is running some of the onboard systems like air conditioning to keep the vehicle cool and protect the battery while it's parked. But good question. We're looking at all those different ways of combining technologies to get to net zero and beyond.
What about charging while we drive on the roads?
Well, again, there are there've been experiments for a long time with inductive charging, which is really good. I just would say driving around Canada with snowplows going by. I think that anything embedded in the surface of the roadway may be a bit of a challenge, but we'll see.
Did you want to add anything, Lauren?
Oh, no, I think Stephen captured it perfectly. And I think that that's also just part of the spark of all of this, right? Is that thinking about the questions of why not, right? And trying it out. That's, for the past 100+ years, whatever the number you quoted, many things have been the same, but the questions that we ask now, and it is a little bit, like I said, of the Wild West, that who knows what that next startup is going to be in this industry.
We have to leave it there, but thank you both very much. This
Thank
was
you.
really interesting and enlightening.
I'm Dawn Kalea, editor of Report on Business magazine, and I'm pleased to be moderating our next discussion. Next up, we have a panel of business leaders from different sectors talking about their strategies they've used on the path to net zero. Let's introduce them. First up is Frédéric Morency, Vice President of Sustainability and Innovation with Schneider Electric. Sorry, I've got Monday marble mouth. Hi. Next, we have Ashwin Navadia, Chief Financial Officer with Equifax Canada. And finally, Joanna Jackson, Director of Sustainability and Innovation with Minto Properties. Hi. Oh, suddenly it got deathly silent in here. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So let's jump right in. I'd like to start first by asking each of you briefly sort of what net zero means at your organization and a bit about your progress so far. Frédéric, start with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dawn. And very, very pleased to be here today and being able to participate to this exchange. Sustainability at Schneider Electric, it's been at the heart and into our strategy for the past 15 years. Really, it started from the impulse from our CEO, Jean-Pascal Tricoire, 15 years ago, really putting sustainability as a core priority for our company. It was said this morning, really transforming this as a purpose for our company, and this is something which made a huge difference. So since then, we had a series of sustainability. So it looks like I was speaking very as loud as I could, but there is a limit into which I'm able to speak. So I don't know where I have to restart, but let's continue. So since 2008, we have had a series of ESG programs and plans that have been renewed every 3 or 5 years. They've been externally audited. It's been part as well, the progress, the performance of our plan have been part of our executive, but also thousands of our managers since then. So we've made collective progress towards this. Our first plan was far from being perfect. It was a step in the right direction. And in 2021, in our recent plan, we took SBTi targets towards net zero. First, 2025 having carbon neutral on our operation, 2040 carbon neutral on our full value chain, and net zero by 2050. In there, what makes our plan, I feel, quite special is we're very much committed and driven to our own commitment, but we have embarked as well with our partners and with our customers, which is super important there. We've got, in fact, over 2,000 sustainability experts around the world that are really helping our customer make their journey, make concrete result from their plan, which I feel it's super important. In our recent plan as well, we've taken concrete commitment towards, for instance, reducing by 50% the emission coming from our top 1,000 suppliers. We've as well taken a commitment to reduce by 800 million metric tons the CO2 emission from our customers. and also one that is super important for us, to train 1 million people around the world around energy efficiency and energy management. In 2021, we were extremely honored to be recognized by the Corporate Knight as the most sustainable company. A great achievement, but it took some time to get there. That doesn't mean, Don, that we have finished the marathon. We're pretty much in the race, like all you guys here in the room and with our industry peers. We probably have somewhat of a head start, but we are really much focused on the fact that there is still a lot more in front of us. So.
Excellent. Ashwin?
Yeah, so firstly, thank you for having and giving me the opportunity to talk about Equifax's journey on sustainability and net zero. So when we talk about environment-related or climate-related sustainability, it's actually embedded within our ESG framework itself. And that framework is actually aligned to our corporate goal and objective. So it's part of our mission. And we being credit reporting agency, but ultimately a data analytics and technology company, it's part of our mission. And our mission is to help people live their financial best. So how does it kind of go into that? We're a technology company in the end, or a data company. And we have a lot of mainframe-based servers or data centers that we are currently using. So we are now on a journey to actually decommission those physical assets and move to the cloud-based technology. And in doing so, it's not just that we're shifting it to another organization, but we're actually being very selective on who we partner with, why we partner with, and then what's our plan for that. So that's a key part of our pledge to become sustainable and net zero. Our goal, and an ambitious goal, is to be net zero by 2040 across the globe. We have operations in about 25, 26 countries now, so you can imagine the kind of requirements, the standards are different, and we touched upon that a little bit earlier. So even as simple as even real estate decisions. In the North America, we look at LEED certifications or standards. In Europe, it's the BREEAMs. It's in Australia, it's the neighbors. So it's all the standards globally that ultimately lead to one goal, which is around climate sustainability. We've also kind of migrated one full location in Costa Rica and certified it to be completely net zero. So that's a huge achievement for Equifax. And as Frederick was saying, it's a key priority for Equifax as well to achieve that goal. So yeah, I mean, I think that's it's an interesting journey that we are on, and it requires a lot of commitment, a lot of alignment of resources, but I think the fruits and benefits are certainly ahead of us as well.
Joanna?
Thank you. So similar to Schneider and to Equifax, ESG is really part of the DNA of Minto Properties. So as an owner and manager of a portfolio of rental properties across Canada, the majority of our carbon emissions is the scope 1 and 2 emissions from our buildings themselves. So we have committed to the Science-Based Target Initiative in addition to our broader ESG strategy that we've developed over the last 5 years. So we've committed to a 50% reduction of our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 2030, and then net zero carbon by 2050. In terms of the details, we're in the process of looking at how that is going to be rolled out across the portfolio, and then starting to implement the projects. So the main challenge with ours is that we've got this portfolio of apartment buildings that are lived in 24/7. So the big challenge there is going to be how to implement these projects within the occupied buildings. But we're starting to chip away at that and are really seeing how that works within our bigger ESG strategy.
So all of you have sort of raised the specter of sort of scope 3 emissions in your answers here. So I think I'll just fast forward a little bit to talk about that. So Ashwin particularly, you spoke about one company's scope 3 emissions is another company's scope 1, as in the case of data centers, for instance. So I'd just be interested to hear sort of how you're accounting for that and what some of those things that you're looking for in partners entail.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think earlier, just to reflect on what was said earlier, I think Coro mentioned that anywhere from 70 to sometimes even 95, 98% of your emissions are in the scope 3 or in the third-party supply chain. So therefore, it's very important for any organization to look at scope 3 initiatives as well. And for Equifax, it's no different. We are about 70% range, so right in that range of what Cora was mentioning about. And as I mentioned about our transformation to the cloud or our journey to the cloud, that's a big part of scope 3, or it's a big part of our transformation and our pledge towards net zero. And we have actually chosen to partner with Google, on their Google Cloud platform. They're already net zero today with a goal to be completely carbon free by 2030. So certainly, I think it's a part of the decision making that went into choosing Google as a partner. And that's one of our largest partners as part of the platform. But that same philosophy applies to several other suppliers as well. And we've closed down already 19 data centers, and that's provided us over a third of savings in terms of global gas emissions kind of metric tons usage as well. So that has helped a little bit. Now, when I look at Equifax, and especially scope 3, we've actually looked at 3 areas which have been very critical in terms of scope 3 enablement. One of them is just the purchase of goods and services. We talked about Google and such other technology and other emerging technologies out there. The other one that we've also kind of listed as a priority is around employee commuting. I think we've all adapted to new ways of working thanks to the pandemic, the good and the bad. Certainly this was the good part of it, where it accelerated some of these discussions, some of these adaptations and change in policies and principles across the globe, across the organizations. And that has helped a lot. So we monitor that very carefully, and aligned with that are many other initiatives within the organization that will swaddle between scope 1 and scope 2. And the third piece is around business travel. So the good thing is you start measuring what business travel has been, how are we introducing new technologies to try and reduce that footprint itself, such that we are able to not necessarily require people to travel as much, but yet at the same time provide the same experience as we were in person as well. So I think there are a lot of initiatives in place. As you said, the size of the prize is large when you look at scope 3. So having focus and effort around that gives you the best results.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating that sort of, data has to reside somewhere, and, moving to this sort of digital economy, like that lives somewhere. Right. It's not just literally in the cloud. I think a lot of people don't think about all the energy that data centers suck up. So, how about at Schneider?
Yes, so as I said, Don, we've embarked in reducing 50% of our top 1,000 suppliers. And then there's been a ton of learning. And we launched that. We were still in the middle of COVID. And what did we learn is we learned that most of our top 1,000 suppliers are smaller size companies that we needed to help to train, educate, engage into this program, which that took us some time, but that helped us to develop new trainings, new tools to equip our partners, our suppliers with the right data and the means to being able to take actions. We help them to embark on their decarbonization journey, but as well what we've done, which I think was making a huge impact, was to help to federate a larger number of companies on their assessment of what will be the requirement for renewable energy credit and carbon offset, and rather than to leave them alone facing this, helping them to figure that out, helping them to make this proper transaction with the right renewable energy credit, because out there could be different class of renewable energy credit or offset, which can be, for the non-expert, quite complex to figure it out. So, and that's where our experts are really helping our suppliers like that to figure that out in the proper ways.
Right. And Joanna, how about at Minto? I mean, you mentioned you're dealing primarily with scope 1 and 2 as a builder of buildings. So how are things playing out there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a slow go right now. We've done several studies in terms of how you actually decarbonize buildings. The main issues there are to try to get your building heating and cooling loads as low as possible before you do the switch from natural gas heating to electrification. So we're quite excited that we're implementing our first project. It's a building here in Toronto that's part of the City of Toronto's Deep Retrofit Challenge. We're really excited to implement there and be able to share the learnings with the wider industry. In terms of building decarbonization, it's a bit of an easier one because it is a newer building, so the building envelope is in really good shape, so it's not quite as technically difficult to decarbonize. And then we'll take the learnings from that and start to work on the buildings that are a bit harder from a technical perspective, especially the older ones that need a lot of work on the envelope upgrades before we decarbonize the heating plants.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this hinges sort of on the electricity grid, right? So, and that's a thorny problem because it involves pretty much everyone and it involves a lot of infrastructure. So how are you, all of you, sort of coping with that challenge?
I don't mind jumping into this because this is really a topic that I'm quite passionate about. Yeah, on the road to net zero, there is certainly a huge pressure on our energy infrastructure across the country. And according to the recent NRCan Energy Fact Book, you know, Canada is the 6th biggest electricity producer in the world. That's not, you know, something lightly to be taken. So we are an energy-rich nation, and the great news is that from the start, 83% of our grid is already coming from non-emitting sources. We're the first nation with that kind of starting point. But yet, to being able to decarbonize our economy, we will need, and experts are saying, is it a factor 2 or factor 3? It's massive. It is absolutely massive. So I think there is really a call for action for more energy efficiency. I think we need to care more for the energy we have in the country, making sure that we are more efficiently using it. So I think there is a lot to be done on that front. More sustainability, engagement, and commitment that are being able to be traced, tracked, and as well, we need to think about the resources that will be required to being able to support the electrification of our economy. So certainly we are quite concerned about the fact that our industry is going to require a lot of talented, passionate people to come and join the ranks to being able to make it happen. So huge responsibility for the industry to being able to train, reskill, upskill the industry workforce. So there's going to be quite a challenge in front of us, so certainly.
Yeah, it's also so uneven across the country, right? In Alberta, it's primarily, like a lot of it's coal-based. Here, we're nuclear. Obviously, in Quebec, it's hydro. So it's sort of all over the place right now. Joanna or Ashwin, you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I'd say that's one of the major challenges that we face right now is that each building owner seems to be operating in its own silo, and then the building industry as a whole is operating in a silo compared to the utility providers. And there's a huge opportunity to reduce the load on the grid if buildings are able to communicate with each other, because the peak demand on a residential building is going to happen at a very different time from an office building or from a school. So if we can look at a community and look at how can we reduce the consumption on the entire grid and be able to communicate with different buildings, there's a huge opportunity there. And right now, there doesn't seem to be anybody stepping in to be that mediator between the building owners and the utility grids. So there's a good opportunity there. We definitely need more electricity, any way you cut it. But if we're able to electrify our buildings and communicate within the grid in an intelligent way, we can definitely reduce the demand.
How do we make that happen? How do we get everybody talking?
So it's something that I bring up at all the different industry groups, the Canadian Green Building Council, RealPAC, BOMA, and I think the message is starting to get out there, and there are starting to be the different levels of building industry groups and also different levels of governance that are now trying to set up those conversations with the utility groups.
And I think if I may kind of jump in a little bit in terms of smaller steps that organizations are taking, like even if I look at just Equifax and one of the buildings and the offices, even as simple as, workspace optimizations or initiatives through like, motion sensors for lighting or for heating or cooling, that also can have a huge impact, even if it's at a smaller scale and one level, one floor, one organization. I mean, once you build it up across, it definitely, flows into larger savings of the electricity grid. So.
Frederic?
Yeah, so, and the good news is that it's not a technology problem. So we've got the technology to make it happen, to your point. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the energy crisis in Europe right now, which is also driven by something quite terrible with the war. But right now there is a mobilization. There are energy directives that are deployed across Europe that are demanding for more energy efficiency, that are demanding for that energy flexibility to be happening. So, of course, we're probably not with a similar situation and context in Canada, but there's certainly something that got to be learned from that. And at one point, we're going to need to embark into it in a more cohesive way. And we've got the technology to make it happen at the grid level, but also at the demand side in the buildings, and having both of them being able to communicate.
Right. So, one of the issues is around, exactly as you say, regulation. We need more regulation in terms of reporting and to help make this happen, a little bit more stick and less carrot. So do you have, any of you, maybe Ashwin, you want to start, what needs to happen in terms of regulation?
Yeah, so I think, even Angie mentioned earlier about regulations. First let's get back to the basics in terms of understanding the data, standardizing the data, establishing certain baselines. And I think that can also be a challenge in itself, even though it may come from a regulatory perspective. And so where Equifax has actually participated in TCFDs, and also even in science-based technology initiatives. So a lot of those initiatives are actually helping in terms of standardizing across the globe as well. And as long as the fundamentals are aligned, I think the regulations will kind of reflect that in some shape or form. Especially for Equifax, where it's operating almost across the globe, it's very difficult to expect harmonization across each of the jurisdictions that we operate in. But I think the good news is that the fundamentals are actually aligned. So we are actually, we've been participating in TCFD for 3 years now, and each year it's a refinement to the next level. So whether it's around the measurement, whether it's around collective or collecting the data, or whether it's even around establishing baselines through third-party reviews. And we also talked about reporting side of the house, where finance or internal audit take a bigger role in that to make sure that the disclosures are correct as well and accurate. You don't want to have a data that you reported and in the end it turns out to be inaccurate going forward. Right. So I think those are very critical factors in establishing a baseline before we have regulatory requirements or even motivations to do that.
Right. Does anybody else want to jump in on the
I'll say that from a building perspective, it sounds a little bit weird, but more regulations would help, and being consistent across regions and provinces, because we can just start to develop our plans there with some certainty around are there going to be carbon caps on buildings? What are those carbon caps going to be? And we can start to develop the plans. And how is that going to be monitored? You talked about data quality and benchmarking. It's things that we've been doing for several years, but there's an industry-wide standard. So trying to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, that we're all working towards the same targets, and there's a common reporting system would really help out.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm absolutely in phase with what Joanna said. And again, coming back to Europe, it's been 20 years in Europe that there is the building efficiency directive that have been deployed. And it's been consistently looked at with the industry, to make sure that we are all staying in sync. But there's 20 years in the making, 20 years of experience, and today you cannot build, you cannot rent, you cannot sell a building without having the proper energy rating being done. And when you think about it, so it does create a clear picture of all the building stock, because it's one thing to put at the city level net zero directive for the new build to be net zero, but 99% of the building, or maybe less than that, but will be there in 2050, and we need to act on the install base of building. So this is where I feel, again, there is some lesson to be learned in Europe, which are clearly into they've been going through in the past 80, 100 years to several energy crises. So I think there is some learning again for us just to anticipate, but again, it's certainly some regulation will be required on that front.
I mean, is it just a jurisdictional schmozzle preventing this from happening?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, you know, we've set at a federal level, Canada has to be net zero carbon by 2050, and now it's up to each province. So, and we're not inventing the wheel on this. Like, this has been going on in Europe and other areas of the world for many, many years. So we can build on everything that has been developed prior to us, but we just need to provide some consistency across the region.
Solutions.
Yeah, I'd like again to jump into there, just to maybe to be a bit provocative, but in the recent years, we've been, Schneider Electric, very close to the Indigenous Clean Energy Association in Ottawa, and I did participate to some of their events, and I can tell you that, let's say, collectively, we're quite energy lazy. When you really see that some of the remote communities that could change the way they are able to create local food production and so on. So I would say that we're, being again provocative, we're a bit energy lazy in Canada.
Right.
So.
I mean, I think that's part of the problem with having an abundance of it here, I guess. Ashwin, did you want to jump in on that, or are you good?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I'd love to talk a little bit about just, you know, some really concrete advice that you might give to you know, anyone listening on how to even get started. I think there's probably a lot of smaller organizations in particular that are maybe intimidated by this prospect if it's not sort of specifically within their brief. So what would you say to those companies or entrepreneurs? Whoever wants to.
If I may go, since I passed the last question. No, I think, you know, whether the organization is small or large, I think having the focus, understanding the reasons why this is important, kind of gets the alignment within the organization as well. It's very critical to stay very diligent, you know, track the progress, be focused, and be bold. There will be times when things will not be clear. The journey will never start off smooth, no matter whether you're the first player out the gate or the 1,000th player out following the 999 ahead of you. It'll always be unclear, but make that first step. I think that's most critical. Most companies, and I'm sure people will agree, the hardest part is to get off the ground, establishing the baseline, establishing the metrics, establishing the targets, establishing sustainable and consistent methods of tracking this itself is a challenge in, you know, by itself. So for organizations that are sitting on the sidelines or thinking about this, that's going to be the biggest hurdle for them to cross. And so, as I said, just staying diligent, focused, and metrics-driven could be a great way for us to, for the organizations to get started.
Right. Joanna?
I'd say start planning now. The federal requirement to be net zero carbon by 2050, we're 27 years away, might seem like a long time, but in terms of building lifespans and executing these decarbonization projects, which can be quite complex, it's really not that far away. So understand what the regulations are within your industry, know what your timelines are, and then start that planning process. Because especially within the building industry, any time that you're touching your building envelope or your mechanical, your electrical systems, that's an opportunity to reduce your carbon, and you don't want to miss any of those opportunities. So you got to take stock of what's going on at a building by building level, but then also at an entire portfolio level, and develop that plan out to 2050.
Now, you had mentioned when we spoke earlier just about technology is moving so quickly that it's difficult to sort of commit and implement. So how do you kind of deal with that?
Our approach is we're going to start executing on projects with the technologies that we have now, and then keep on doing pilot projects and looking at new technologies as they come in, and make sure that our plan has that flexibility. You know, we know what we want to do within the next 5 years, but then, you know, 10 to 15 years out, we know generally what we want to do, but the exact technology that we are going to be using, we haven't locked in yet. Right. So give yourself the flexibility to be able to adapt to whatever technology comes out. And there will be a lot of changes that happen within the next 27 years.
Excellent.
Yes, so for me, I think there's several elements that has been said that I would certainly echo, but there is two pieces of advice. Towards sustainability, we need certainly leadership, clear leadership and commitment from the top that it's a priority. and we need digital. We need digital solutions. So without leadership and digital solution cannot be happening. We need to equip our teams with proper tools. I see there are several people from finance. Microsoft Excel is not going to make it. We need proper tools to being able to crunch these data, really, to being able to have a proper tools. At Schneider Electric, we use Resource Advisor, which is a corporate tool that is really helping us to advance this. So, towards sustainability, we need leadership and digital. And there was a very, very solid code that I heard in a previous engagement, which I'm going to reuse. We don't need to be great to start something. We need to start to become great. And I feel in all of what we've just talked about, it's about creating the movement, creating even not perfect, engage and make it happen. So.
Right. And we just have 1 minute left, lightning round, something that gives you some sense of optimism that we're going to wrap our arms around this issue. Anyone? Dead silence.
I think if I may kind of jump in terms of optimism, I think for Equifax, the progress that we've made around the transformation of the cloud and partnering with an organization that's already carbon neutral today and becoming carbon free in the next few years, itself gives the momentum for the organization to get through this. And we didn't even talk about some of the smaller initiatives, whether it's workspace optimization, whether it's waste management initiatives, whether it's other kind of smaller and larger kind of initiatives within the organization. Whichever industry we look at, there are ways and mechanics to actually get to carbon neutral. You set the goal, stay diligent, and track your progress, and mobilize the resources, I would say.
Right.
I'll quickly say, I'm
Yes.
really excited that investors are starting to ask the questions about our net zero carbon plans, because when the money starts flowing into it, that's when the action starts to happen.
And for me, what I'm super encouraged, in Canada, we have 20 sustainability ambassadors from coast to coast, and I'm so amazed by their local engagement and what is emerging from the local presence and their action. So that gives me hope. That gives me hope that it's not staying at the leadership. We're across the organization. We have people that are really committed to it. So.
Excellent. Well, literally to the second. I'm sorry we have to leave it there. I know that there are a couple of questions, but please stick around for afterwards. There's cocktails. You can maybe grab one of these people here. Thank you, all three of you, for being here today. We really appreciate it. And now I'd like to hand things off to Sierra Bain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn, and hi, everyone. My name is Sierra Bain. I'm the author of the Globe and Mail's Climate Change newsletter. I'm happy to be here and excited to be having a conversation with a tech entrepreneur focused on carbon capture. So with that, please welcome to the stage Fred Lalonde, co-founder and CEO of Hopper, a travel booking app that grew from concept to multi-billion-dollar valuation. Fred is now embarking on a new venture called Deep Sky to capture carbon emissions. Welcome to the stage, Fred.
Thank you.
Hi, it's nice to see you in person for the first time. So let's get started. I really want to just dive into getting everyone acquainted with the technology. Could you give us a high-level explanation of what it is that you guys are trying to do?
Yeah, so we have a different thesis than most people, although it's getting adopted more and more, which is that every ton in the atmosphere is going to have to come out, full stop. So every barrel we've burned at $40, 60, 100, 120, everything that's up there, all historic emissions, they're all going to have to come out. Why? Because the Earth is unstable above 320 or 340. The last time there was the same amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere now, the Earth had already warmed to 6 degrees. The way that this works is there's a giant carbon cycle that's circulating about 750 billion tons. And if you do things like lose ice sheets, warm the ocean by 1 degree, the natural system starts spinning up hundreds of billions of tons, way more than we produce. And this has already started. So I don't know how many of you know, we passed 1.5 last week. Raise your hand if you saw this. It was an FT this morning. For the record, about 10% of the room is raising their hand. Maybe people are lazy after lunch, but fundamentally, the ocean is actually warmed this year by 50% over last year. Right? So everything is going parabolic. It's all going to have to come out. So how do you do it? This is going to sound crazy, but you basically pump it out of the atmosphere. You pump it out of the ocean. Why do you pump it out of the ocean? Because of something called Henry's Law. This is how you get Perrier. CO2 is solvable in water. And when you heat Perrier, you'll notice the outgassing accelerates, but also if you just have CO2 in a closed system, it'll go into the water. The ocean has been taking out about 1/3 of all the CO2 we've put up. And what happens if I pull out 1 billion tons all of a sudden from the atmosphere? The ocean's going to give us half a billion tons back. So we have to do it simultaneously. Then what do you do with it? You can't make vodka or carbon nanotubes or cement or Louis Vuitton shoes. You can, but no matter what you try to do with 1 billion tons of CO2, you're going to saturate the market in minutes. So it has to go back underground. The way you actually stick it, there's a whole bunch of new technologies. A bunch of them are too energy intensive. The problem with this issue is if you look at the math of doing the entire energy transition, we don't actually have all the power. You've been hearing all these people tell you, we need to build this, we need to build that, our grid this, our grid that. We're going to need at least the same amount of energy to pull the CO2 out. We definitely don't have that. And you kind of can't burn natural gas to do that. It doesn't make a ton of sense, right? So you have to capture it at the chimney first. The first time we captured CO2 from a chimney and put it underground was 1972. We've known how to do this for longer than I've been alive. Not by much, but 1 year. The Norwegians have put millions of tons in an offshore platform. We've known how to do this forever. You can also run it through volcanic rock. That's been done in Iceland for about 6 or 7 years. It works pretty well. When you inject it underground, you want to go really deep, a couple miles, same place you find the oil and gas. In order to capture it from the ocean, you're just moving the water in and you're splitting the molecules. It all comes down to 2 things. The technology is very simple. It's not a battery. It's not a solar cell. But right now you have guys in labs running things the size of postage stamps. We need something the size of this building. We are going to have to build, over the next 2 to 3 decades, an industry that is larger than oil and gas just for the removal. You don't have to believe me. You can just wait. You'll see what's going to happen if we don't do this. And what we're trying to do is kickstart this because in Canada, we have an enormous amount of renewable energy already, and we have the right geology to do this. We looked at every power grid, every geological map on the planet, and there's only 2 places where you could reach megaton scale quickly. One of them is Canada, the other one's Russia, and there's a bunch of reasons why it's not going to happen in Russia.
So we've established, like, I can't, make a bag with the carbon that we're storing, but where will that be stored? You mentioned underground. Is this happening by, the oil and gas sector? Like, where does it go?
So the first thing that needs to happen is we need to cap our emissions, right? So think of this as waste management. Instead of letting the CO2 go up in the atmosphere and worsen this problem, we have to not do that and trap it and put it underground. So the good news about that is, as I said, the tech's been available forever, and you can just pull it where you're emitting it and just put it underground because the geology that you have under anywhere where you're extracting oil and gas is favorable. It's actually the same structure. Not to bore everybody, but you have these different coats of rocks and sand that form when it's not volcanic rock, and these caps move over geological time. Sometimes they fill with dead dinosaurs, then you get oil or gas. When they don't, they filled with what's called saline aquifer water. You're thinking of like water, but it's brine. It's so salty if you drank this, you'd die. But the good news is if you drill into that and you pass enough caps, you can actually inject the CO2 here. There are actual pipelines of CO2 in the US. They span thousands of miles. What they're used for is actually to force natural gas out because the CO2 is actually a very heavy molecule, and you can use it for forced extraction. But if you go more gently, you can actually leave it there. Over about 10,000 years, the CO2 will react with the rock caps and remineralize. It'll actually become rock again. Now, if you have a Category 9 earthquake, the CO2 would actually leak out of there, and you could actually go and say, well, even having it underground for 600 years is probably a better idea than what we're doing. So when you do it at a chimney, about 1/3 of what's coming out is CO2. And so you got some cool stuff like cyanide that you have to deal with in that chimney, but we know how to do this. Then you take it and you push it in. So that means if you move 1 million molecules, you get 300,000 of CO2. If you're pulling it from the air, you have to move 1 million molecules to get 424 molecules of CO2. That's what the 424 parts per million. As a species, we don't know how to move 1 billion molecules of air a minute through a filter. We've never done that. And then you have all sorts of problems because what we really need to do is pull out 800 billion tons of CO2 and a ton's a ton. That's if I stop the economy and we ride horses and hunt for our food. If we actually meet our net zero targets, it's going to be between 1.1 and 1.4 trillion tons that have to be taken out. So there's a few places where you have enough saline aquifers to put it in. Under the St. Lawrence Valley, we're kind of at the end of this. You could do it underground here. There's anywhere between 8 and billion tons of storage. But if you go west to Alberta, where we actually have our oil sands, the structures underneath that have been characterized to be able to hold anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 billion tons. And it turns out we have a pipeline that runs the entire length of our country. All of our renewable power is in the east, all of our storage is in the west. There's the only other place you could do this is the Permian Basin, which is Texas and Louisiana, but then you have a power issue. It's very difficult to generate the kind of energy that we're talking about without nuclear to do that.
Great, thank you. So we know you primarily as CEO of Hopper, the travel app, and moving into the carbon space is a bit of a jump, but I sense there's a connection there. I'm wondering, could you explain a bit of the path you took to get here?
I'm still the CEO of Hopper. I've raised $1 billion. Like, we're not public yet, so we're a $10 billion private company, for those of you who might know us. So I'm still doing that. The reason I started this is when we were starting to scale up, Hopper started getting big in 2018, 2019. 2020 was an average year, as you can imagine, because we sell travel. But we started getting pretty big, and I was looking at how much travel we were selling. So this year we're going to sell about 7 billion globally in about 100 countries. And I was looking at all the CO2 and I'm going, hey, what are we doing? We should do something. And we started a nature-based program. So we've planted 25 million trees. We did this ourselves. I didn't even know what a nature-based offset was. So we just sent our data scientists to Kenya and said, find trees that we can plant. And we found a partner and we've been doing it. And we have a commit for another 30 million trees. We did that. Thought I was awesome, that I'd solve global warming, that everybody would like me. And we started looking at the data around this, and I realized that it's kind of all a joke because the trees are going to start pulling out CO2 in 20 years, yet you booked that trip last week, and I sent you to Cancun or wherever it was. And fundamentally, there's something wrong about that. But then what if there's flooding and all these mangroves like go under, right? So the nature-based stuff has a major permanency problem. And then I didn't understand what CO2 was, where it came from, all this stuff I've been talking about. So I started reading up on it, and it's one of those very few problems I've had in my life where I was going, well, this can't be right. This can't be right. When you realize that the Earth was actually 6 degrees warmer at the current concentrations, not if we emit, like you go, wow, there were palm trees in the Antarctic the last time there was this amount of CO2 out there. You can go look at it on Google. All the ice was gone, right? So when you realize this, you go, wow, like something's really wrong about how this works. And there's no conspiracy. There's not people running around in castles wearing hoods that are trying to lie to us. Like the IPCC data, we tend to think that the science is exact, but the error bars on the relationship between concentration and temperature are enormous. The fact is we don't know because the planet's a very complicated system and there's forcing functions. So I was looking at that and going, what? like how come I don't know this? And the more we read, the worse the situation got. And so we started looking at what's going to go wrong first. First of all, this is an economic problem, right? The Earth has actually seen 5 mass extinctions. The last one, 95% of everything that was alive disappeared, and we came out of that. So if we blow our face off, which is what we're doing right now, and all this turns back to dust in 1 million years, the dolphins will be absolutely fine. Like, nobody's going to miss us, trust me. This is an economic problem. If you have money, you control assets, you operate a company, how are you going to do what you do, like selling travel, if there's no food? So what do you mean? Well, what happens when there's drought? When there's drought, the productivity per acre starts to go down. And so if you look at this, 10% of the arable land in California has gone offline in the past 2 years. That's through drought because, you know, that whole reservoir and the Colorado River you've been reading about. There's currently a looming rice crisis. Do you know how many people eat rice on this planet and what happens if we don't have it? It happened in 2008. Rice prices actually hit the same high that we had in 2008 when people died over the fact that there was no food in places like Philippines that are far from here. We're basically seeing a global drought that isn't letting up. And so we believe that we're at the beginning of a global collapse of agriculture. I don't mean in 2080, I mean this year. And if you look at the indicators around food costs, look at what's going to happen to the price of beef, all this stuff is starting to happen. So I was looking at this data, and when the agriculture reports, I'm subscribed to all these weird newsletters for like bushels of tomatoes and all the farmer, like as you'd imagine. And when I saw the data come in for last summer, you know when those rivers run dry and there was these floods in Pakistan, I looked at just the agricultural loss and I freaked out. My plan was to bring Hopper public and then start this after, because I needed another company like I need a bullet in the head right now. But fundamentally, when I saw this data come in, I freaked out and we started it. This summer is going to be much, much worse.
We talked about this idea of agricultural and drought and what that means in our pre-interview. What does that say about the speed at which we're moving? I think a lot of people say we're moving too slow, but
we're off by an order of magnitude right now. Like, we're talking about commits and small steps in ESG. This is like and so I'm not actually going around screaming this because I don't need to. You're about to find out. When, like, just think back to the pandemic when you went to the store and there was no toilet paper. Like, it's going to be more gradual, but we're about to hit at least 50 years of that. And it's because our food system is starting to fall apart. Now, in emerging countries, it's going to be terrible. The Horn of Africa is starting to starve. And if you want to know what this looks like, look at Syria. So global warming destroyed agriculture in Syria. You can just Google this. You'll find articles. We just don't care because, right? But like, global warming destroyed agriculture through drought in Syria. Almost every military-age male and female moved into the cities, and they all picked up AKs. And you basically have a failed state. Now, this is starting to happen. Look at what's happening in the Mediterranean. Look at the migration that we're getting from South America, right? We're talking about 10,000 people at the border of Canada and Quebec and all that, like this winter. But you're like, where'd they come from? And the answer isn't like New Jersey. It's Peru. It's crazy, right? Because it's starting to hit that way. So in developing worlds, in developing countries, you're going to have the basic food uncertainty, mass migration, which is going to lead to political instability in every country that borders this. And it's already started, right? You saw that ship? Like, the Mediterranean is going to turn into Mad Max no matter what we do. Second, if you think of a rich Western society, and it's hard. Look outside, all this money, all these buildings we're putting up, and look where we are. But fundamentally, if food prices continue to rise as they're rising now, and just look at your grocery bill. Just look at what's there. Why is it so expensive, right? Don't tell me it's because of natural gas or Ukraine. That's not true. Like, we get our food from California, and it's all fine. The gas prices have been stable, right? So what's happening is basic supply is starting to decline. Why isn't anybody talking about it? Well, look this week. The articles are starting to come up. Why didn't we talk about it last year or the year before? Because the pandemic hit everything. Timing of the pandemic on this one topic was super weird because we printed money, we shut down our economy, which probably wasn't the best idea in the world, and we gave everybody free money, so everything went up. The price of a used car was 3 times higher, all this crazy stuff. Then China shut down, declined to reopen for almost a year, so all the supply chains broke. So of course, the price of everything goes up. But notice what's happening down now as inflation is going down. Open up the inflation index, look at the details. The food stuff's not going down, it's going up. And if we had not had the pandemic, my guess is we would have noticed 3 years ago that something was wrong. We just got red shifted because, all the craziness, the masks and the staying home and talking to everybody on Zoom. So fundamentally, this is starting to happen. And what really scares me now, I thought we were going to have more time, is the clips year over year are accelerating. So, if something was 2% the year before, it's now 4%, it's going to be 8% next year. And nobody really has any data on this because it's never happened before.
So once commercialized, what might Deep Sky mean for businesses who are interested in offsetting their carbon emissions?
So no matter what we do, every business, every bank, every pension fund, every family is going to have to ask themselves this question. Who should pay to remove your historic emissions? So if you're a bank that's been around for 200 years, who should pay to pull out all that CO2 that you put up? if you're a mining company, an airline, right? And so there's one company on Earth that's committed to removing all of its historical emissions right now. Somebody know? Microsoft, right? So Bill Gates quit in 2001, I suspect, to tackle the climate crisis, if you look at what he's been investing in for 20 years, which is kind of fascinating to me that he'd figured this out that early. So you're going to have to remove your historical emissions, or the government will have to do it. Either way, somebody's going to have to pay to do this. The industry in question is going to be larger than oil and gas. It's basically oil and gas running backwards. It would be a really good idea for us to restart nuclear, because we sort of gave up on that in the 70s, and that's kind of did two things. One, it put up 300 billion tons that we could have avoided, but it also means we don't know how to generate the energy we need to pull all this stuff out. So that would be cool too, but fundamentally, we have to remove. Who's going to buy this? Right now, what would be a really good idea, if you have any control, any influence over ESG, start marking removals in your budgets, right? You're doing avoidance, sure. You're doing nature-based, that's what I'm doing. But start getting into a state where you will be paying, don't choke on this, $400 to $800 a ton. That's the cost of real removal today. Will it go down to 100? No way, it's impossible. Taking stuff out of the atmosphere, compressing it, putting it on the ground is never going to cost $100 a ton. That's ridiculous. Nothing costs that, right? So this is going to cost anywhere between $200 to $400 a ton to do, and we're going to have to pay for it. Yes, that's $1,000 trillion. It's completely nuts, but we have no choice. Otherwise, all of our economic systems are going to start to degrade. So the choice is this, or have every asset class, including all GDP, go negative forever, right? That's basically what we're faced with in 20 or 30 years based on what we're seeing now. Could actually happen faster. So voluntary markets, look at your programs, start earmarking small amounts for carbon removal. Of course, like, I have interest in this because I started a company. That's not the point. The point is, if there are customers, the capital will start to flow. The technology is simple enough. The problem now is that the market, the technology, and the legislative environment are all unknown, so capital can't come in at the scale it needs to. So the one thing that all of you can do if you control budgets, figure out how to sign up for some amount of removal. The quantity doesn't matter, and the amount of money you'll be committing to will be blended in your global ESG. You have to do your scope 1, your scope 2, all that other stuff, but start thinking that the energy transition in itself is not enough. We have to lean into removal as a society, as a civilization.
And you kind of touched on the piece of responsibility. What responsibility do you think government has versus like the individual companies? Like, where do you think responsibility lies?
Well, we all got into this mess together, right? So you could say, oh, oil and gas, we should shut them down, and they're evil. But like, if we shut down oil and gas, we're going to starve within a year. We need the energy. That when we took this weird tangent in the 70s, and I'm a child of the 80s, I was taught duck and cover in school. Some people too young to know what that is, but they would tell you if there's a nuclear attack, go under your desk, which makes no sense even to a 6-year-old. So I come from that era, and a nuclear power plant was called a nuke, like an actual nuke, and it was the one thing we were scared about in the 80s. And somehow the Berlin Wall fell in 1990, and there were no more nukes. I still don't understand what we did there, like mentally. I think we're just done with it. But fundamentally, it was super scary. And then there was 3 Mile Island, there was Fukushima, and all that in Chernobyl, obviously. And it scared us, and we can't do anything with the waste, but what we're doing now is much worse. So fundamentally, there's that component that has to start up. The rest, like, it is what it is.
So, we're not going to shut down oil and gas, but it is still the biggest source of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you see carbon capture changing the trajectory of that, or, will it?
So there's 2 parts. Point source capture, are we going to burn gas? Yes. Are we going to burn oil? Right, so just anybody know what was the year where we hit peak coal, where we reached the most amount of coal that we're producing, and then we started going down? 2016, 2010? We haven't hit it yet. We're still producing more coal every year. Peak oil, same thing. Peak gas. We've actually not slowed down. So one thing, we got to capture it at source and put it underground as quickly as possible. The tech's available, that's just legislative. Second, we have to start spinning up a nascent industry, shorelines, We got to start pulling out of the ocean so the ocean starts to help us out rather than hurting us, and we need to pull it out in the atmosphere. And it's basically a question of kickstarting an industry as quickly as possible. The point source is not that. That's just, hey, oil and gas, you want to continue to produce? You have to do this. Most likely, we're going to have to pay for this as a society and subsidize like we are the rest.
So we're on to our last question that flew by, but we're talking about scaling, and I just wanted to ask what the challenges are in scaling, particularly for
everything.
TCI. Yeah.
Everything. So think of how long it took us to get global shipping, oil and gas, a computer, right? Like it usually, as a society, we do this over 30, 40, 50 years, and then there's an acceleration curve on it. We kind of have 20 years. The right year, we actually calculated this, the right year to start decreasing our emissions in order to avoid removal was 1946. The right year to start doing point source capture was around the 70s when we actually figured it out. So we have about 20 years to do what takes us about 100 years. That being said, we haven't been defeated yet as a species. What I hope is the following, is this will be painful enough. We're probably going to get through it. It's not going to be great. I don't think uncontrolled agricultural collapse is a soft landing. I think we can do a lot better. But I think this will be painful enough that as a species, we will learn not to behave like we've been behaving. And by the way, the First Nations of every country have been telling this to us for 300 years. We're the ones that didn't listen.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I feel like we could go on forever, but thank you so much for indulging me in this conversation. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you. And for our final discussion, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Adam Radwanski.
Hello, and thank you very much. Thanks, Sierra, and thanks to all of you for being here today. It's been a good afternoon, and I think we've got a good way to end up here. For those unfamiliar, I write about climate policy for the Globe. I'm also losing my voice a bit, I apologize, and you're going to hear a lozenge in my mouth, sorry about that. I'm pleased to bring up in a moment somebody who I think is very well suited to giving us a bit of a big picture look at where Canada's at on this trajectory. Dr. Bruce Lowery is the president of the Ivy Foundation, which backs efforts in Canada to put us on net zero trajectory and compete in the clean economy. I'll just say that I didn't quite appreciate until I came onto this beat very shortly before the pandemic, which was its own challenge I won't talk about, but I didn't fully appreciate the extent to which Bruce has been, to the extent to which he is influential in shaping Canadian climate policy, both personally and through the really quite impressive network of groups, NGOs, et cetera, that the Ivy Foundation backs. So he is very well positioned. I've really enjoyed, over the course of my time on the beat, speaking to him and gaining his insights, and I'm glad to have a chance to do that a little bit for all of you here today as well. On that note, please join me in welcoming Bruce Lowery to the stage.
Thanks, Adam.
So, welcome again. So I mentioned a moment ago, on the Ivy Foundation, maybe it's a good place to start, because it's an interesting point, not just in Canada's trajectory, but in the Ivy Foundation's trajectory. It was just announced earlier this year that Ivy is going to wrap up its operations by, I think, the end of 2027, and in the process, spend its full $100 million endowment. I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a bit off the top about why. I mean, why now? What makes the next few years worth doing that in terms of this long-term effort?
Yeah, sure. Primarily, the decision's really based on the fact that we do have a climate emergency, right? And so emergency means you have to act fast. Emergency means you have to take all of your resources and do what you can to try to solve a problem. So for us, that's, the Ivy Foundation has been around since 1947. So it's quite a momentous decision for the Ivy Foundation and the family. And you know, considering a whole range of things, they just felt that was the best thing to do in order to advance this agenda.
Let's talk a bit about sort of across different sectors. Actually, first, following up on the discussion we just heard, which is maybe a good entry point. I mean, you have a pretty high-level view of what's happening across different sectors. And in terms of breakthrough technologies and what we need to get over the humps, I mean, are there particular technologies? We just heard about versions of carbon capture. Are there particular technologies when you get up in the morning right now, what's getting you excited in terms of where you're seeing potential exciting progress that's worth throwing support behind?
Yeah, I think I organized a session with the Faculty of Engineering at McGill a few weeks ago, and there's so much, say, technology that's emerging within the next 10 years that we don't really even know about, like advances in batteries, advances in metal-based fuels, advances in building technologies, and so there isn't, you know, climate change. In fact, the title of this thing was, you know, arrows in the quiver. There's no silver bullet for climate change, right? There's going to be lots and lots of technologies across lots and lots of sectors, and we basically can't sit back and hope that carbon capture works or hope that we rescale up nuclear power. We're going to need a whole lot of things. But I guess what really struck me was storage technology and battery technology in particular. And I think we are going to see advances in, you know, 100-year batteries with sodium that don't need cobalt and lithium. Like a lot of the problems that people raise now about batteries, I would say the research community solved most of those problems.
How are we doing at backing that here? I mean, that's something that I spend a lot of time wondering about, particularly long duration storage, which seems like the key to unlocking renewables so much. And for reasons that I heard discussed a bit earlier, Canada's not always, on electricity particularly, we don't always have the urgency on there's some other countries doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's, it came up a couple panels ago too. We've got some real structural issues in this country, right, in terms of provincial-based utility models that are essentially overseen by provincial governments. And there isn't that incentive to basically create a national strategy. I mean, the comment that came up about, you know, having Europe-wide guidelines or Europe-wide regulations for things. We don't even have Canada-wide regulations for things in most sectors in the country. So we've got a terrible problem getting things done in this country because of this, you know, broken up parochial provincial approach. So we have to get over that.
Yeah, I want to come back to a whole bunch of things you just said there in a moment. Just to come back to the sort of sectoral overview we were talking about off the top. I mean, Ivy does fund efforts in a bunch of different areas, largely through Transition Accelerator. I mean, you've got in terms of transportation, in terms of buildings, I think, the grid. Where are you seeing right now, if you look at the major sectoral contributors to climate change in Canada, where are you seeing the most encouraging progress, and where are you seeing sectors which are really badly lagging, which kind of keep you up at night?
Yeah, I think we've made massive progress in personal vehicles and light-duty vehicles, and I think that's, like, they're well on their way for that problem, I think, being solved, you know, through electrification. I would say the building sector is tough, not because we don't know what to do, but for a bunch of the reasons that we were just discussing. And it takes time, and you basically have to mobilize, you know, many parts of the economy. You have to mobilize, you know, you have to get way more training, the financing, the provincial and municipal regulations and standards that get in the way. So the building sector, I think, is going to be a slow one in terms of meeting our targets. And then a few other things are in between, say, like the electricity grid and the again, we know what we need to do. We just kind of have to get on with it.
You didn't mention oil and gas there, and I feel obliged to raise it. Particularly, we're heading into a kind of a hot summer on this, or fall maybe, but by the time it happens. But with federal government planning a cap on oil and gas sector emissions, which is going to be highly contentious. How are we doing? I mean, this is obviously for Canada one of, if not the trickiest aspect of climate policy. How is that evolving to your eye?
Yeah, I mean, if I had my PowerPoint, I'd put up a slide that showed greenhouse gas emissions in Alberta and greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario, and basically the bars are the same size. One's going up and one's going, or has gone down. And so that really defines a lot of the political polarization that we see right now. So, I mean, the previous speaker didn't so much convince me about direct air capture, but absolutely convinced me about putting a cap on oil and gas emissions. I mean, that's what we need to do. It's hard. We have to figure it out. We have to transition it over time. You can't, you know, obviously turn off the sector tomorrow. But that is the #1 priority in terms of our own emissions, is really reducing oil and gas sector emissions. And I mean, it's unfortunate that we've known about this for 30 years and we've had a pretty good idea what to do about it for the last 10 years. So I think it's just time for the oil and gas industry to really step up and figure this out.
So I mentioned that cap, and you just mentioned that cap that's coming on not production, but on emissions. There's a lot of regulation coming in the next few months, and we've got clean electricity regulation that's coming, ZEV mandate that has pretty much already been announced. At the same time, we just saw a federal budget that went some length toward trying to match the Inflation Reduction Act and trying to provide incentives. So, I mean, the carrot and stick discussion, I heard it again raised in another panel earlier, and it inevitably comes up. It is obviously a balancing act. We, I think, try to strike that a little more in the US maybe, which is going more carrot-oriented perhaps. How are we doing on that? I mean, is the balance about right? Do you want to see more carrots, more sticks? How are we navigating that?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the government, I think they're doing not a bad job of balancing it. I mean, we don't have nearly as many carrots as the Americans, so we have to use a combination. But if you understand how sectors transition, how transformation happens in terms of technology adoption, it's always a combination of carrots and sticks. And so you often have to start out with the carrots, figure out where a sector is going, and then you can bring in the regulations and actually set standards. And we heard, I'm always pleased to hear someone from the private sector, such as Minto, say that sometimes we need more regulation. And if you look at the question that comes up so often from the private sector is we need political stability, or we need certainty, or we need policy stability. And really the way you get that is by setting standards and setting regulations and making sure that they don't flip-flop every time a government gets elected. So we're doing not a bad job, I think, of that combination.
I did want to ask you about that. I mean, this is an obvious concern, and frankly, it's a bit of an elephant in the room, I find, whenever talking about government climate policy. It's the federal government, which is that we don't know how much of this lasts beyond a change in government. Yep. How do you bake in these policies? How do you give them some shelter from that political uncertainty? Because some of them, carbon pricing obviously being one example, don't work particularly well if companies don't know if they're going to stay in place or not.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's a really big issue in this country because we've seen flip-flops and complete removals of carbon pricing systems before, of course. So there's a couple of things. You can put in very specific measures, policies, like contracts for differences, which they're discussing right now. I'm not an expert in that by any stretch. The other thing you can do, which is, I think I find a challenge for our federal government is they're sort of taking too much ownership of all of the policies, too much ownership of the problem. And this is a problem that is only going to be solved if businesses are on board, if provinces are on board. And so really, there needs to be a greater sense of shared responsibility for how we solve this. So having business coalitions, business groups, a lot of what we're doing at the Ivy Foundation is helping support these coalitions that are behind a ZEV mandate, or coalitions that are trying to decarbonize buildings. So the more that the private sector takes over, the more I think you can hope that these things will endure beyond a change in government.
Yeah, I mean, that ties into, I think, what is probably a fairly central project of the work that you do, which is trying to frame the climate push in an economic competitiveness frame, which I've certainly noticed in the 3 or so years that I've been on this beat. It's something that the government federally used to talk a lot about. The environment and the economy are not at odds with each other. Yep. I've sensed it's become much more of a driving factor and maybe gotten some traction, but I'm curious to hear your assessment of where we're at in that project, because it does seem for a lot of people that as morally compelling as the climate case may be, it's the economics that really speak to it and move some people who might not otherwise be concerned about it.
Yeah, I think without question. And and as you're saying, it's a lot more than just framing. I mean, this is fundamentally about retooling the economy. So it's an issue about the economy. It's an issue about competitiveness. And you mentioned the IRA in the U.S. I mean, if we're not able to compete in Canada to make sure that we're at least part of North American supply chains, to make sure that our manufactured products, auto parts, et cetera, are playing a role in solving this North America wide, then we're going to be left in the dust. And I think we've seen that realization in Ontario in a big way. Just I wouldn't have imagined 3 years ago that we would have seen the billions and billions of investment in battery plants, auto plants, et cetera. So it's absolutely an economic and competitiveness issue.
Yeah, can you speak a bit more to that? I find the Ontario example really interesting, and I think it's, it is one that surprised me as well. I don't know if many people saw a scenario in which Doug Ford was playing up the merits of electric vehicle manufacturing as much as he is. Is that, I just wonder if about any observations from that. I think you've tracked that very closely, and that might be replicable in other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely, and I think the issue for Doug Ford isn't whether they're electric vehicles or not electric vehicles. They're the vehicles of the future. Like if you want to build cars for the future, they're going to be electric. So you better be in the electric vehicle business. And if you're in the electric vehicle business, and the Ford government are big proponents of mineral exploration and mining, so why not mine the critical minerals that are going into the cathodes, that are going into the batteries, that are going into the cars, right? So we can actually create in Ontario, and in fact in many provinces in Canada, a very strong economic advantage in not just in North America, but I think globally in critical minerals, in manufacturing. So huge opportunities. But I think the government, they care about jobs, they care about the economy, they care about trade. That's all the reasons why you do this. You don't really have to care about climate change.
We talked about regulations a moment ago, more in the stick sense of regulating emissions reductions. The other aspect of regulatory policy is in terms of how we regulate new projects and whether in terms of permitting and so on. And something that you hear a lot, and certainly not just here, because the U.S. this has been a storyline early on in the IRA rollout as well. It's just that our regulatory processes are so slow that it just takes too long to get stuff built. And to talk about the infrastructure we need, that's going to be a problem. How much confidence do you have in being able to speed that up? We're hearing talk out of the federal government about trying to streamline things and so on, but how do we get things built at the rate we need to get them built at?
Yeah, I mean, that probably is one of the biggest challenges we have, and as you say, it's not only in Canada. They're having the same conversations in the UK and in Europe. Just how do you accelerate the building of infrastructure, and particularly transmission and energy-related supply projects. But I think Canada is particularly bad. I mean, I think if you look at globally, we are very poor at getting projects built. So one way that's become clear is you have First Nations participation and you have equity participation. If you look at most of the big new generation projects that are getting approved, they all have First Nations participation in them. So I think that's crucial. And we talk a lot about kind of the federal regulatory process. What people in my view, seem to often miss is all of the bureaucratic burdens that take place, within municipal utilities, within, energy regulatory systems at the provincial level. So we've got all these barriers that just make it really, really hard to get things done. And that's going to be hard because I don't think right now we have a very good system for working across those levels of government.
Do you think there's the will to deal with that? I mean, this is something I wonder about. There's a lot of talk right now, and then you get a little concerned when you hear things like, conducting a review to reduce regulation, which kind of sounds like it could go on a while. I mean, do you sense that governments are more seized with this than they were a few years ago?
Yeah, I think without question, and I do a lot of work in the electricity sector, and that is one of the single biggest issues right now is how do you get projects built? And it's a little easier within provinces, but if you look at where we need to get to, and there were some references earlier on to doubling or tripling our electricity system, which is absolutely what's going to be needed, we need to make sure that we've got interregional planning, we've got transmission systems that are connected across provinces where it makes sense. So we basically have to rethink a lot of the governance and planning structures in this country. They've got to be bigger, they've got to be outside of parochial, provincial priorities, and it can't be run by the federal government either. There has to be some kind of regional self-organizing.
You mentioned electricity a couple of times, so I just want to ask you on that, and in terms of sort of the silos and barriers, do you have much confidence in the possibility of provinces working more closely together on this? This always comes up, and building more connections between them. And if you look at a map of Canada and you alternate, there's basically hydro-rich provinces next to almost every province that maybe still relies more on fossil fuels. I don't know that there's much confidence in the ability to actually really develop sort of national policies in this sense. Do you, or regional cooperations, do you have much confidence in that?
Yeah, I don't think national policies will work. There is, I'm on the new Federal Electricity Advisory Council, or whatever it's called, and
Canadian Grid Council.
Yeah, they changed the name.
Okay.
Yeah, but something like that, and that's certainly a desire. Like I would say there is a legitimate desire among the utilities and regulators in Canada and project proponents to sort this out. So again, this is something where you can't sit back and hope the government does something. I think the businesses that have an interest in building projects and businesses that have an interest in investing in those projects, they need to be at the table to make sure that some of this gets sorted out.
I just want to ask you quickly about workforce. We just at the end of last week saw the federal government table its sustainable jobs legislation, the legislation formerly known as Just Transition, which has been kind of an oddly contentious debate, but this is something that most countries, I think, are grappling with, not just in climate or in clean industry, but generally workforce shortages. But there is a project, I think, that's probably necessary in terms of ensuring our skills are aligned with the jobs of the future in these sectors. How again, sort of in terms of how that's evolving, either relative to other countries or just what you're seeing in terms of the evolution of this discussion, are you seeing enough priority on it?
Yeah, I think it's good that finally emerged after quite a few years. Yes, so I would say I'm familiar with one project. They call it C2R2, which is Canadian Colleges for a Resilient Recovery, and they recently secured some federal support to work on micro-credential training across community colleges across the country and the cégeps in Quebec. So I think those kinds of initiatives, the fact that the federal government's supporting it, the fact that the community colleges kind of self-organized around this, I think that's really great to see. And I know in our conversations that we're having with organized labor, the Alberta Federation of Labor, IBEW, Unifor, others, I mean, there's a huge interest in this. And so I would say that's actually on the right track. I mean, it's really important. But every sector is facing it, and every country is facing it. Labor shortages will continue to be a challenge.
We've got a few minutes left, and I just want to kind of bring this back a little bit. We've talked obviously a lot, and probably of mostly of interest to the audience here, about some of the sort of the economic impacts here, how different sectors evolve, making this more a case of economic competitiveness. I do wonder if you want to reflect a bit in terms of what this transition means for people's day-to-day lives, which I feel like is sort of somewhat taken a back seat in the public conversation recently. How do you, if you in the efforts that you're involved in backing, how do you engage people in this in a way that's not just about moral responsibility, but I guess captures imaginations about how our lives might improve in the coming years as a result of new technologies? Like, what are some of the more compelling arguments, or are we doing a good enough job of that already? Are we not doing enough of it? What's your feel on that?
Yeah, it's really, really tough to try to talk to the public about what the future might look like, right? Well, because no one really knows what the future will look like, but it's very hard to capture someone's imagination about the change that's required, the future that we're building, those kinds of things. It's much easier for those who have an interest in maintaining the status quo and making sure that change doesn't happen to tell a convincing story about why we can't move quickly, why we can't change, why you're going to lose your job, why the economy is going to crash. And so I would say that side of the equation it has been very effective at mobilizing public support to slow down and not make change. So we think about this a lot, and we do research on this, and it's very, very tough to do. Where we do see opportunities, though, it's that combination of, I think people are finally getting more fearful, the fires that we just saw, the floods, smoke, health issues. So I think motivating people around the fact that, and this is where I would say a lot of people have missed the communications opportunity, is I think we're going to continue to see significant health issues going forward related to climate change, whether it's air quality, health, heat, water quality issues. And so I think that's a way to motivate the public. And I would say the other thing is just for people to get prepared that there will be change, and change, means anything anyone can do to sort of think about or understand or be willing for willing to kind of participate in getting a heat pump or understanding the electricity needs. I mean, that's, but again, it's, there's a tendency for government and business to say, oh, well, we just need to educate the public and then everything will change. Well, the public doesn't design heat pump regulations, and the public doesn't cap the oil and gas industry, and the public doesn't design carbon pricing systems. So the public basically just wants to know what's going on, but you can't expect them to understand it or design it. So
I guess I wonder, and just to wrap up on that, I wonder on this, my own, watching how the debates evolved in the last few years, I wonder if the pendulum has swung a bit in that when you go back to the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk around green recovery and how it would, then it was tied into sort of social benefits and how it would make people's lives more affordable and so on. Then, we had an energy security crisis globally. More recently with the IRA, we've had this real kind of competitiveness push. And, I granted almost like probably 90% of what I write has some paragraph near the top about the importance of competing with the US. So I take full responsibility for my small part of this. But do we need to, have it swung a little too far from what this means for people who are worried about their bills right now and so on? Or is it pure benefit right now that we're just talking about the economics of it?
No, I mean, I think, if you look at personal economics, I think affordability is going to be, one of the real kind of dividing points going forward, especially when it comes to electricity. So there is some very good research that shows, the overall, done by the Climate Institute, that shows that overall energy purchases by households will go down over time. Because we're going to be shifting away from fossil fuels for transportation to electricity, which is really cheap, but electricity for heating will go up. But on balance, things won't go up a lot. But affordability is going to be a flashpoint conversation by politicians on both sides saying your plan is going to be unaffordable. And then again, it's we'll see. That's going to be something where I think the public really does need to engage in, like what does affordability mean? And it's going to be different across the country, right? Some regions are going to feel more pain on energy price increases than other regions.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. We're just about out of time here, so I want to say thanks again.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate this, and I enjoyed it as always talking to you.
I want to thank you for all your great reporting. It's been really, really helpful for our country. So thank you.
Kindly. Appreciate it. Great. So on that note, I want to say thank you again to everybody for joining us here today. In a couple of weeks, I think you'll get a link to the recording of this event, whether you're watching here or virtually, which we encourage you to share around. Watch again, watch many times if you want. Highlight, skip to your favorite parts and so on. I want to thank as well our sponsors for making this day possible. That includes HSBC Canada, Schneider Electric, Toyota Canada, Flow, and our academic partner, the Groot School of Business. And now we're just going to invite you to enjoy a bit of more networking, refreshments, and so on just outside of here. So thank you again, and we'll chat outside.